The story of Narcissus is one of an arrogant young man cursed for his hubris to fall in love with his own image until he withered away. A life spent too long gazing in a mirror that it was devoid of personal growth and wisdom. Now, about The Last Jedi. Get in, nerds, let's ruin some art. Mahler's infamous assertion that The Last Jedi is an objectively bad film was a declaration that launched 1,000 ships.
This may shock you, but Star Wars The Last Jedi is objectively bad content. It is provable. This is factual. You may enjoy the film, and even love the film, that's absolutely fine, but it is a poorly written film that stands as an objective insult to intelligence.
And he was correct. As the great Pablo Picasso once said, learn the rules like a pro, so you can break them like an artist. Art pros love the breaking part, but often loathe that what they're breaking are the rules. Rules you're allowed to break like an artist. In other words, a genius can break these rules with vision and expertise, and still express a message. But simply breaking the rules doesn't require genius, and ignoring that there are rules at all is infantile nonsense, a notion predominantly held by eternal children, adults who refuse to grow up and insist on playing pretend. Pretend artists creating pretend art inspired by pretend genius, with their fellow pretenders pretending to give their mess meaning. But that kind of fantasy can be intoxicating. To paraphrase Joseph Campbell, they remain fixated to the unexercised images of infancy and have become disinclined to the necessary passages of our adulthood. Or to quote Campbell directly, in the United States, there is even a pathos of inverted emphasis. The goal is not to grow old, but to remain young, not to mature away from the mother, but to cleave to her. After all, why waste time perfecting your craft, clawing your way up, and suffering rejection and humiliation when you could just drop a bucket of sand and call it a masterpiece? Needless to say, discourse erupted into one heated argument after another, and even today, the topic is a hotbed of passionate opinions. Some have dubbed the film as a subversive masterpiece, while many fans more mark its release as the death of Star Wars. Gone, not with a bang, but quietly drowned in a sea of endless Disney slop, like farts in the rain. But now, nearly 10 years later, and knowing how bad things could really get, one bold assertion spoken years past now returns to relevancy. Have we in fact judged this film too harshly? When the online discourse burned hot, the most popular cope in The Last Jedi's defense was to point out The Empire Strikes Back and note how supposedly hated that movie was upon release, only to be hailed as the best Star Wars film years later. That we vile and vicious chuds simply missed the point and lacked the high IQ points required to understand its genius. And that years later, The Last Jedi 2 would be celebrated as the greatest Star Wars movie ever made. And Rian Johnson wasn't actually a hateful hack pleasuring himself to his own unrestrained ego. Well, time has passed, heads have cooled, and now we can revisit the old battlefield and ask, was Mahler right about the film? Is it truly bad on an objective level? Was it truly a masterpiece, and wrongfully persecuted because it dared subvert one too many of our expectations? Did we really overlook genius because we were too invested in heroes, laser swords, and cool explosions? Or perhaps the question we should really ask is, why did we hate it? Well, looking back at the film so many years later, the answer to that question is easier than ever. Why was the film so divisive? Why did Star Wars fans despise the film with the righteous fury of heaven scorned? Because this is a film that objectively despised everything Star Wars was about, and chose to corrupt everything noble about the series. Ruined my childhood is something commonly uttered in response to The Last Jedi, and all too commonly brushed aside by the dollar store highbrows who stand in the film's defense. According to Gizmodo, ruined my childhood, a petty term that merely means someone hates a modern installment or version of something you loved as a kid. So-and-so ruined my childhood cannot be said meaningfully. It can only be whined. The Last Jedi ruined neither my childhood nor the Star Wars franchise. While the phrase is a bit hyperbolic, it isn't inaccurate. And unsurprisingly, Gizmodo gets it wrong. The phrase ruined my childhood can absolutely be said meaningfully. In the the case of The Last Jedi, it can be said with enough dramatic weight to qualify as an icon of body positivity. As the film desperately tries to subvert expectations with all the mastery of a Sanju comic, it does so by targeting and dismantling all the elements of Star Wars we loved most as children. As much as the mainstream might find the very idea of men having anything of their own critically offensive, the story of Star Wars is a uniquely masculine journey. To grow from nothing, worthless in the eyes of the world, to learn a craft, conquer your flaws, and become a wizened knight who slays the dragon and proves themselves worthy of fair princess through sheer bravery and nobility. A powerful, masculine story that, to no surprise of any normal person, appealed to generations of young men. Well, what might a feminine story look like, you ask? Here's what Joseph Campbell had to say. There's a motif that comes in American Indian stories very often, what I call the refusal of the suitors. A girl with her mother lived in a wigwam on the edge of the village. She was a very handsome girl, but extremely proud and would not accept any of the boys. They proposed to her through the mother, and the mother was terribly annoyed with her. Well, one day, they're out collecting wood, and they have gone a long way from the village. And while they're collecting the wood, a terrific darkness comes over them. Now, this wasn't the darkness of night descending. When you have a darkness like that, there's some magician at work somewhere. So the mother says, well, let's gather some bark and make a little wigwam of bark. Wigwam for ourselves, and collect wood for a fire, and we'll just spend the night here. And so they do that, and the mother falls asleep. And the girl looks up, and there's this magnificent guy standing there with a wampum sash, glorious, and feathers, and all of this kind of black feathers. He says, I have come to marry you, and I'll await your reply. She accepts the guy, and the mother accepts the man. And he gives the mother the wampum belt to prove that he's serious about all this. So he goes away with the girl. She has acquiesced. Mere human beings weren't good enough for her. But here's something that really, so she's in another domain. Now the adventure is marvelous. To summarize, feminine stories favor emotional or social conflict, relationships, social expectations, and love, while masculine stories center around physical conflict, building your worth and slaying the dragon. And what could be more masculine than training to become a knight to defeat an evil empire? So it isn't because a significant portion of the Star Wars fanbase suddenly became bigots or because the IQ requirement was too high. The Last Jedi earned its hatred. It's a Star Wars movie that demonizes masculinity and therefore crushes its heart and scars its beauty. The Last Jedi denies honor to its characters, both legacy and new, denies heroism to its heroes, and actively degrades the Jedi Order, the noble warriors who have become the faces of the Star Wars universe. Denial of honor in this case refers to The Last Jedi's malicious refusal to offer its characters respect, especially legacy characters, but also some new characters too. Luke Skywalker is probably the most obvious and prominent case, after being broken down from optimistic hero and into a broken coward content with abandoning his friends, overseeing the final days of the Jedi Order, and dying in complete misery. If there was any character The Last Jedi disrespected the most, it was the franchise's greatest hero. Remember, Luke is the same man who defied his own master's command to slay his father because Luke still sensed good in Darth Vader. And what kind-hearted boy would reject the chance to save his father? To quote Luke, "You told me Vader betrayed and murdered my father." To which Obi-Wan responds, "Your father was seduced by the dark side of the Force. He ceased to be Anakin Skywalker and became Darth Vader. When that happened, the good man that was your father was destroyed. So what I told you was true from a certain point of view. When I first knew him, your father was already a great pilot, but I was amazed how strongly the Force was with him. I took it upon myself to train him as a Jedi. I thought I could instruct him as well as Yoda. I was wrong." And then Luke says, "There's still good in him." To which Obi-Wan says, "He's more machine now than man, twisted and evil." "I can't do it, Ben. I can't kill my own father," Luke says. And then Obi-Wan responds with his guilt trip. "Then the Emperor has already won. You were our only hope." This conversation between Luke and Obi-Wan perfectly exemplifies Luke's hopeful optimism at its most refined. He's grown from the naive young man from A New Hope who wanted to see the galaxy join the Academy and experience adventure far beyond the mundane life of a moisture farmer. But here's where things get both thematically and narratively interesting. In A New Hope, when Luke, Han Solo, Chewie, and Obi-Wan were trapped on the Death Star, Obi-Wan tells everyone to stay behind while he deactivates the tractor beam. Luke, however, learns of the beautiful Princess Leia as being held prisoner aboard the Death Star, and suddenly Luke is putting together a rescue plan and convincing Han Solo to join, with nothing but hope and a dream. While they do save the princess, our heroes are overrun by stormtroopers, nearly getting crushed by a giant garbage compactor, and Obi-Wan Kenobi ends up dead. Years later, as a fully anointed Jedi Jedi Knight, Luke Skywalker had been trained. He'd seen war and felt the pain of good friends dying. He'd made mistakes, had his pride ground into dust, and most importantly, endured the consequences of failure. When Luke Skywalker defies Obi-Wan the second time, he's no longer driven by a passionate, wild-eyed yearning for adventure. His decision to save his father still stems from the same optimism that drove him in A New Hope, but tempered by wisdom and experience. Luke is the same optimistic hero, but he's matured. He's prioritizing morality and consequences over glory. And that, ultimately, is what the hero's journey is about: maturity. This change is particularly important to note when talking about The Last Jedi, because the film doesn't believe this change takes place. In fact, a core message of the movie centers on this change never taking place, specifically in men. Here's what I mean. Young men begin as optimistic heroes who thirst for adventure, dreaming of fame. Like Luke Skywalker, many a young male hero will march smiling into hell for the sake of ego and vanity. All Quiet on the Western Front perfectly exemplifies how the well-meaning yet ultimately self-serving, youthful attitude is not only universal, but easily exploited. Just listen to how the boys' mentors speak, the images they weave in order to sell the Great War to an entire generation of young men. To quote, "You stand on the threshold of existence. Remember this moment. It is a great moment, for in years to come you will be judged on what you dare to become today. The iron youth of Germany. My friends, we are fortunate to be alive at a great time. Our deeds will be the water nourishing the growth of a strong and noble root." Teachers and mentors around Europe filled the heads of young men with dreams of heroism, prestige, and respect for generations to come, all so they'd proudly march off to war. Idealism, romanticism, heroism, the idea that each soldier will come home a hero with a chest covered in medals. Moral quandary or introspection just isn't part of the danger. In A New Hope, Luke was brash and impulsive, ready to take on the world. This Luke would happily kill Darth Vader because that's what heroes do. They fight evil. They slay the dragon. The Jedi fought the Clone Wars, and Luke was ready to fight the Empire to achieve similar prestige. There's no room for nuance when you're valiantly fighting the enemy. This Luke trusted Obi-Wan completely, until it came to bravely saving the princess. However, the wizened Luke Skywalker we see in Return of the Jedi has had his whole world shaken when he discovered Darth Vader was really his father. Luke in A New Hope was confident that the Empire was evil. They were the tyrannical force that ruled the galaxy with a brutal hand, and Darth Vader was both its face and the man who murdered Luke's father. But Luke Skywalker in Return of the Jedi took the revelation of Vader's identity and became introspective. He started questioning what was truly right and wrong. The boyish romanticism he once had was shattered, and he no longer sought to be the man who slew Darth Vader. He respected Obi-Wan's judgment, but found more confidence in his own. Luke had conquered his ego, refined his virtues, and became a hero. In summary, young men want respect and adoration. Simba's "I Can't Wait to Be King" song is a testament to this boyish vanity, where he proclaims his excitement to become king because, to him, being king means doing whatever you want. Young men often act to serve their own ego, and, much like Luke Skywalker, optimistically reach out for glory. And it's this fact that The Last Jedi takes firm hold of, and uses as a bludgeon against masculinity, its male heroes, and Luke Skywalker most of all. You see, the fall of Luke Skywalker from hero to disillusioned hermit only makes sense if the maturity he showed in Return of the Jedi, the same optimistic maturity that pushed him to save Darth Vader against Obi-Wan's wishes, never developed. If Luke Skywalker never grew up. In fact, I'd argue The Last Jedi spends most of its time, and even crafted its central message, to belittle men and tear down the male ego from the perspective that a hero is just a man who never grew up, a perspective also shared by many of the film's defenders. In short, The Last Jedi very much believes in toxic masculinity, and wants you to know that it is in fact icky. We'll come back to Luke Skywalker in a moment. Breaking down the horrific treatment of his character is far from over. But I wanted to start with him, to better highlight the driving force behind the dishonorable treatment of the other characters. Because, oh yes, we've only just begun. Admiral Akbar is a legend both in universe and in our hearts. A brilliant military tactician who notably masterminded the rebels' assaults on the Empire's second Death Star, and was, of course, a member of Leia's resistance against the First Order. As the movie goes, the legendary Admiral appeared only to die alongside everyone else when the First Order TIE fighters blew up the ship's bridge. A hero of the Clone Wars, the man who led the Battle of Endor, and now a leader of the Resistance. Gone in a flash, with not even a final word before his death. If Akbar Akbar's anticlimactic death wasn't insulting enough, the movie's story heavily relies on not only an admiral, but a legendary admiral character to carry out its big brain plot, a role that Akbar was uniquely suited for, both in ability and narratively. Instead, we're given Admiral Holdo, Akbar's diversity hire replacement, recruited right out of Resistance HR, a choice that ultimately hinders the narrative. Admiral Akbar is already an established character. Even if he wasn't in The Force Awakens, his role at the Battle of Endor would have marked his prestige to even newer Star Wars fans. It's possible they might not have known Akbar, but the Battle of Endor was the central conflict of the entire third movie, and marked the day the Empire as we knew it fell. Perhaps most importantly, it's a conflict we've been shown. To note Akbar as the man who won the field that day would certainly explain his importance. His cameo alone would be appreciated by fans, but giving his character a central role in the movie again would have been a gift to remember. Instead, we're given Admiral Holdo, who's yet another character the film demands I respect rather than making them respectable. Holdo has all the charisma and command of a cranky schoolteacher. She's a totally new character, treated like she's been there all along, and must now speedrun her credibility. Credibility Akbar would have carried in droves just by stepping onto the bridge. To make matters worse, when she arrives, the resistance is nearly gone. The soldiers are desperate, terrified, and left facing certain death. And how does she greet them? We're the very last of the resistance, but we're not alone. In every corner of the galaxy, the downtrodden and oppressed know our symbol, and they put their hope in it. We are the spark that will light the fire that will restore the Republic. That spark, this resistance, must survive. Feels more like a speech given by a new CEO. And Holdo's speech perfectly summarizes The Last Jedi as a film. Lots of fancy imagery that ultimately says nothing. And wait, it gets worse. The movie has Poe hand Holdo unearned credibility by saying, "That's Admiral Holdo, Battle of Chiron Belt Admiral Holdo," clearly someone our hero respects and has heard of before. But any respect Holdo is granted by the audience is informed respect. Respect given because we've been told to give it. And building respect on mere demand is like building a castle on a swamp.
Well, the king said it was daft to build a castle on a swamp, but I built it all the same, just to show him. It sank into the swamp, so...
Even the Battle of Chiron Belt is informed. It was never shown on screen, which is why Poe must sound impressed when he says it. Battle of Endor Akbar led his conflict on screen. We know how it went. We watched him fight it. So he's earned love and respect from the audience, and wouldn't need Poe to vouch for him at all. However, with modern Disney and The Last Jedi especially, earning things is a waste of time. And refusing to value a given reputation with the same level of respect as an earned reputation is bigotry. To make matters worse, the first interaction we get with Holdo after the speech is to treat Poe like a child. Remember, Poe opened the movie by taking it upon himself to lead an assault against the First Order, destroying an entire enemy ship. Whatever the flaws of the movie, you can see why so many soldiers choose to naturally trust Poe over admirals and generals. But this also means that Holdo treats the character who most exemplifies traditional male heroism like a child. Poe, I want to know what's going on. Holdo, of course you do. I understand. I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you. You're impulsive, dangerous, and the last thing we need right now. So stick to your post and follow my orders. Had Akbar taken the role, we would implicitly trust him more. Akbar has a long history of stark opposition to tyranny, and the tension would have been higher when he and Poe came into conflict. Akbar must be acting in the best interest of the resistance. But then why is he being so secretive? So when Poe pulls his mutiny, tensions would be high, since we'd be in the dark about which side was right. Both sides are supposedly good, but they're opposed, and one faction must be wrong. Meanwhile, Holdo has no history with us. We're just told she's been selected, told she's amazing, and told she's an ally. Yet, under her leadership, the fleet slowly dies, and Holdo does nothing to stop it. By the time the resistance is down to one ship, it certainly seems like Holdo is a First Order spy, leading our heroes to their doom. And had this been a normal movie, that's exactly what would have happened. A celebrated admiral sitting at the highest position in the resistance with full, systematic, and social authority to destroy anyone who dares question her, a First Order spy. Tensions would be through the roof. But Poe staged a mutiny. How is that heroic? Funny story about that. In the Next Generation episode, The Pegasus, Captain Picard gives us some interesting insight into his mindset when he decided to choose Will Riker as a first officer. I was looking through the records of about 50 candidates, and Will's was very much like the others, filled with lots of dry statistics and glowing letters of recommendation that tell you nothing. I was about to put it aside and look at another file, and then something caught my eye. There was an incident on the Altair 3 when Will was first officer of the Hood. He refused to let Captain DeSoto beam down during a crisis. He disobeyed a direct order and risked a general court-martial because he thought he was right. And when I read that, I knew that I had found my number one. Does the incident sound familiar? In other words, Captain Picard valued Will Riker's moral code, that he'd disobey orders, defy his captain, and put his own career in jeopardy if it meant doing the right thing over simply doing what he was told to. Oh, and to those who still believe Poe should have trusted in Holdo, Holdo's Star Trek peer, Admiral Eric Pressman, had some interesting views on the topic. Like Holdo, Admiral Pressman believed in loyalty above all else, that no soldier under any circumstance should ever betray or disobey their leader. In fact, Admiral Pressman too was hiding a major part of the plan and used his admiralty as a shield, just like Holdo does. And that secrecy led to this exchange between Picard and Riker. Riker, I've said all I can. I'm under direct orders from Admiral Pressman not to discuss this, sir. Picard, very well. He's an admiral, I'm a captain. I cannot force you to disobey his orders, and therefore I will have to remain in the dark on this mission. And I will just have to trust that you will not let Pressman put this ship at unnecessary risk. And if I find that that trust has been misplaced, then I will have to reevaluate the command structure of this ship. Dismissed. Picard might be obeying orders for the time being, but he's not afraid to retaliate should the secrecy place his ship at risk. And here's how Admiral Pressman responded to Picard after hearing that he specifically chose Riker as first officer for his willingness to put morality over self-interest. Pressman, frankly, I've always felt it was more important for an officer to trust his captain's judgment. In a crisis, there's no time for explanations. Orders have to be obeyed without question or lives may be lost. While both views have some valid points to give, Pressman's views stem from self-interest. He, like Holdo, hides behind his authority to protect a project that not only destroyed his last ship, leaving his crew to die, but violated a treaty with another major faction in the Alpha Quadrant. In the end, Admiral Pressman was placed under arrest. So a secretive admiral demanding obedience and hiding behind her authority being a secret villain doesn't seem too far-fetched. I'd also like to note that Riker's arc throughout the episode centers around a mutiny. Pressman's crew turned against him when they learned how dangerous and illegal their experiments with the cloaking device had been. Riker had been too young and idealistic then, and defended his captain without question. But 12 years later, he'd become a seasoned first officer, and his entire heroic arc from his early days until now had been learning one major thing. The right thing to do had been to place morality over his career, join the mutiny, and turn his weapon against an immoral captain. To quote Pressman, now that doesn't sound like the same man who grabbed a phaser and defended his captain 12 years ago. Riker, I've had 12 years to think about it, and if I had to do it over again, I would have grabbed the phaser and pointed it at you instead of them.
So on reflection, you'd rather be a traitor than a hero.
I wasn't a hero, and neither were you. What you did was wrong, and I was wrong to support you, but I was too young and too stupid to realize it.
So again, in any other story, under the same circumstances, Poe would have been acting like a traditional hero because he disobeyed a direct order and risked life and career not because it was a glorious thing to do, but because he believed it was the right thing to do. Unfortunately for Poe and, well, all of us, The Last Jedi despises heroism. In fact, the reason why I'm focusing on Akbar's dishonor and Holdo's role is because she symbolizes much more than a shallow attempt at girl power. If you pay close attention to the film, Holdo is not only central to the film's plot, but also the spearhead of The Last Jedi's central theme. In Leia's own words, she was more interested in protecting the light than she was seeming like a hero. Or to clarify the film's true theme, being a hero is silly, because in the view of The Last Jedi, it's defenders and girl power politics. Masculinity is silly and childish. The Last Jedi's ultimate point is to demonize and belittle traditional masculine heroism, and Holdo is the sour face leading the way. Note the words seeming like a hero. Remember when I said The Last Jedi and its infantile views are forged upon the male hero at the beginning of his journey, when he's most obsessed with ego, and then how the film completely ignores the possibility of a mature hero? Keep this in mind. We'll come back to this soon. All the movie had to do was give Holdo's role to Akbar, and we could have had our tense moment where we placed a far more brash Poe up against Akbar, the wizened war master of the Republic. Essentially, pit two heroes at different moments in in the hero's journey against each other, the daring youth versus the veteran warrior. But instead, Admiral Akbar was given a dishonorable death and brushed aside for a far shallower character who's only there because the movie refuses to give a man an admirable moment of glory. A triggering assertion, I know, but let me ask this. Why not have Admiral Akbar play this role? It would win major fan points, be a cameo that actually made sense, and wasn't simply there as cheap nostalgia bait. And besides, his cameo too would have served as an epic last stand for a beloved character. And the Akbar maneuver sounds much better than Holdo, and the resulting memes would have been otherworldly. What did Holdo's character add to the story that Admiral Akbar's character could not? The real answer is none, because Holdo barely has a character other than being Rian Johnson's movie mommy. Everything given to Holdo, from informed legendary status to informed brilliance, could have been covered by Akbar in a far more impactful way, both narratively and philosophically. Does it really take a genius admiral to essentially say, keep driving while everyone dies around you? I have my doubts. Some might say, again, that this is hyperbole. After all, how else would an admiral in this position have acted? In Star Trek The Next Generation two-parter episode Chain of Command, we're introduced to a character named Captain Edward Jellicoe. Captain Picard has been selected to participate in a deadly mission into Cardassian territory. Captain Jellicoe was selected to replace Picard aboard the Enterprise. Just like Holdo and now Akbar in this new scenario, Jellicoe finds himself suddenly in command of a new ship with a whole new crew. Here's how he enters the scene. Jellicoe, William T. Riker, class of 57, graduated 8th in his class. I'm looking forward to serving with you, Commander. I'm sure this change in command has taken everyone a little by surprise. It's caught me by surprise too. I must admit, I missed the Cairo already, but a Galaxy-class ship, that's something special. How many duty watches does the crew stand? Riker, we have a standard 3-shift rotation. Jellicoe, I'd like to change that to 4 starting tonight. I'd also like to examine the duty roster of the crew and evaluations as soon as possible. I want readiness reports from each department head by 1400 hours, and a meeting of the senior staff at 1500. Do you prefer Will or William? Jellicoe immediately shows that he studied up on the situation and the ship's crew, greeting Riker like a colleague rather than a superior. He even empathizes with Riker over the sudden loss of Captain Picard, tells us how he misses his old ship, as well might have been in a similar situation, and then compliments the Enterprise as something special. Then it's right to business. Before Jellicoe reaches the turbo lift, he's already given several major orders, including a meeting with the senior staff, showing that he's friendly, empathetic, yet confident and very much in charge. Even though Jellicoe is new, there to replace our hero, and steamrolls Riker with his no-nonsense attitude, he has a certain amount of charm that makes him immediately likable. I imagine Admiral Akbar's hypothetical entrance would be much the same. Instead of the empty corporate speech about oppression and symbols, we could get something like this.
I'm not going to lie to you. The situation is dire. We are the last of the Resistance fleet, and our fuel tanks are running low. And perhaps the most devastating news, General Leia Organa is in critical condition. The General and I have been friends for many years, and I feel the same worry you do, the same pain you do. And I'll be the first to admit that I could never hope to replace her or match her tenacity. However, I've earned my spurs on countless battlefields, stretching all the way back to the Clone Wars. I led the rebel assault at the Battle of Endor, and the Empire did not win the day then, and I promise you, the First Order will not prevail here. You have entrusted me with your lives. I will not fail you.
Or something like that. And then he would proceed to rapid-fire orders, getting the fleet back into shape. And that leads us to the next question. How would Akbar respond to Poe's challenge? Well, again, we can return to Captain Jellicoe. You see, Jellicoe is the captain who convinced Deanna Troi to change from her lounge attire to a proper Starfleet uniform, which stuck beyond the episode's conclusion. I bet Jellicoe would have gotten Holdo into a proper uniform within 5 minutes of stepping on board, rather than the ball gown she shows up in. Ball gown and purple hair tells me she's taking none of this seriously. No wonder the Resistance almost died. But how did Jellicoe convince Deanna to change her attire? Here's the exchange. Diana, I'd like to talk about how the change in command is affecting the crew. Jellicoe, I've noticed some resistance. Diana, I wouldn't call it resistance, more like uncertainty. Most of them have served under Captain Picard for several years. They knew him, and they knew what he expected. Now they're being asked to adjust a new captain and a new way of doing things, and they're uncertain. Jellicoe, I see your point. This all could be very unsettling for them. Diana, and to you. Perhaps everyone just needs time. Time for you to get to know and trust the crew, and time for them to understand how you want things done. Jellicoe, I'm glad you brought this to my attention, Diana. Unfortunately, I don't have time for a honeymoon with the crew. You've clearly given this a lot of thought. So I'd like you to take charge of the morale situation. Please see to it that they make adjustments to the new routine quickly and easily. Oh, I have a meeting with the new security chief in 5 minutes, so the duty roster will have to wait. Thank you, Counselor. By the way, I prefer a certain formality on the bridge. I'd appreciate it if you wore a standard uniform when you're on duty. Diana, of course, sir. And that's it. The next time you see Deanna Troi, she's wearing a standard Starfleet uniform. Just like Holdo, Jellicoe is privy to mission-critical knowledge that can't be revealed. world. This is why he doesn't have time for a honeymoon phase with the crew, and why he's unable to comply with Diana's suggestion. But he isn't aggressive or condescending. Rather, Jellicoe is welcoming, receptive, and empathetic. While he doesn't have the luxury of a getting to know you phase, he doesn't simply dismiss Diana's concerns or the crew's resistance. He doesn't simply condemn them to be better and obey. He even puts Diana Troy, the ship's counselor, in charge of the issue. And he definitely doesn't bring up anyone's past mistakes or misdeeds to discredit their needs. In short, Jellicoe responds with respect and gave Diana the authority to solve the morale situation. Compare this to Holdo's reaction. Poe, Vice Admiral, Commander Dameron. With our current fuel consumption, there's a very limited amount of time that we can stay out of range of those Star Destroyers. Holdo, that's very kind of you to make me aware. Jellicoe takes the time to sit down with Diana, give her his full attention, and consider her words carefully. Holdo barely gives Poe the respect of eye contact. And one might point out that Diana is a member of the senior staff while Poe is not. But he is. Keep in mind, even with his demotion, Poe is still a captain, the same rank as Picard, the same rank as Jellicoe. Sounds pretty senior to me. Holdo is far too busy to give any level of attention to a high-ranking resistance soldier who's been in the heat of battle since the beginning. Unlike Jellicoe, Holdo doesn't take charge like he does. She doesn't present herself as knowledgeable, which is why logically, Poe tries to ensure Holdo is up to speed. But Poe is a silly Billy man with that icky masculinity. He doesn't deserve respect despite his considerable rank. Again, even after his demotion, he's still a captain. You know, the same rank Phasma is. But more to the point, not only is Poe Dameron a prominent figure at the Battle of Starkiller Base, and as a high-ranking officer, Poe commands so much adoration from the Resistance soldiers, he was able to lead an unsanctioned bombing run on the First Order. Is this really the guy you want to sideline? And Poe isn't asking for more or even challenging Holdo's authority. He simply says, we need to shake him before we can find a new base. So what's our plan? And how does Holdo respond? Our plan, Captain, not Commander, right? Wasn't it Leia's last official act to demote you for your dreadnought plan, where you lost our entire bombing fleet? Poe, Captain, Commander, you can call me whatever you like. I just want to know what's going on. Holdo, of course you do. I understand. I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you. You're impulsive, dangerous, and the last thing we need right now. So stick to your post and follow my orders. Bigot. Poe treats Holdo with respect and maintains his courtesy in the face of massive disrespect. He offers information and asks for the plan as any reasonable ranking officer would do. And in return, Holdo responds with open hostility. But I suppose it's fine because Poe was trying to mansplain or something. And that's no good. Now, how might our hypothetical Akbar Jellicoe have handled the situation? Well, honestly, probably with 2 thumbs up and a promotion. But let's just say Akbar has to keep his plan secret, and so must address Poe's challenge. Poe, Admiral Akbar, Commander Dameron. With our current fuel consumption, there's a very limited amount of time that we can stay out of range of those Star Destroyers. Akbar.
Ah, yes, Poe Dameron. Very impressive work on Starkiller Base.
Poe. Thank you, sir. Akbar.
As for the mission, I've made myself familiar with the particulars. I might be old, but I can still remember a thing or two.
Poe. So you know we need to shake the First Order before we can find a new base. So what's our plan? Akbar.
I understand your concern, Commander. Unfortunately, due to the sensitivity of the situation, I'm unable to divulge the details of the plan. But rest assured, there is a plan in play.
Poe. But sir, the crew is scared and desperate. We just need a little hope. Akbar.
I see your point, Commander. Leia's last official order was to demote you for the Dreadnought plan, wasn't it?
Poe. Yes, sir. Akbar.
Well, it's not my place to contradict the General. I admire the initiative. And demotion or no, you carry a lot of sway with the men. I hereby temporarily restore your rank and place you in charge of morale. Is that understood, Commander?
Here, Akbar would offer due respect to Poe's accomplishments, empathize with his concerns, and while unable to share the plan, acknowledge Poe's de facto leadership status with the soldiers and give him the task of keeping up morale. Even if Poe was a spy, it's better to have him stuck performing a task rather than just sitting around out of the way, especially since his job will be meeting with other crew members. If Poe suddenly disappears, he'll immediately become suspicious. And if he's not a spy, Poe would assume there's a plan, and that Akbar is aware of the negative impact of not knowing has on the crew, while giving Poe full authority to remedy the situation. This is how a true leader would operate. To emphasize the point, let's hear from Joseph Campbell. The hero, therefore, is the man or woman who has been able to battle past his personal and local historical limitations to the generally valid normal human forms. In other words, Poe, like any other traditional hero, can fight past his own doubts, fears, and his own nature to do the right thing. This is why I pointed out Poe's behavior with Holdo. If Poe really was the impulsive, trigger-happy flyboy we're told that he was, you would think he'd return Holdo's hostility with his own immature, impulsive retort. insults. Had Poe done so, he would have earned both his demotion and distrust from Holdo and Leia. That behavior would have shown us that Poe has yet to master his emotions and battle past his own personal limitations. But that isn't what happened. Perhaps there was one good writer on staff, or perhaps it was the anti-male power fantasy of seeing a woman with power tear down a man who doesn't fight back. But Poe returning Holdo's insults and hostility with courtesy and respect shows us that Poe is in control of his emotions. This is also why I pointed out the danger of a dreadnought and Poe's motivations when defying Leia. Poe wasn't glory-seeking. He saw a rare opportunity to destroy a First-Order fleet killer and made a calculated decision to destroy the dreadnought for that reason. Poe was just treated by Leia, Holdo, and the movie itself as if he was glory-seeking. And that logical disconnect hints at the film's true intentions. Being a hero is silly because masculinity is childish. Poe wasn't treated as an immature flyboy for actually being immature and impulsive. Poe took charge and trusted his own judgment when the critical moment arrived, just like Riker did. Remember, the dreadnought was devastating the base Poe was helping to evacuate, and the Resistance's very last refuge was a base. And things might have turned out very differently if the First Order could just snipe it from orbit. Yet despite Poe's calculated decision, he's still treated like a child. Impulsive or calculated doesn't matter, because the movie views all masculine heroism, regardless of intent, as ultimately driven by selfishness and ego. So when Poe is punished and distrusted, he's not being punished and distrusted for being a glory hound or giving in to a personal flaw. He's receiving consequences for being a hero. So once again, to those still defending Holdo's inclusion and her behavior, why is it important to show Poe such disrespect, treating a captain like a child, other than tearing down masculinity and traditional heroism? And how would acting like a respectful leader, giving Poe a few minutes of attention and addressing Poe's very real concerns, hurt the narrative? And don't tell me she doesn't have time. Holdo spends most of the movie standing around watching the fleet die. But more to the point, how would it hurt the narrative, other than to remove the direct demonization of traditional heroism? In other words, if The Last Jedi isn't trying to tear down traditional heroism and demonize masculinity, in what other way would removing Holdo's finger wagging at Poe harm the story? If Holdo was supposed to be a villain, her open hostility would make sense, but she isn't. In fact, we're supposed to admire the character. And this smoothly leads us to the treatment of Finn, Hux, and Kylo Ren, because not even the sequel trilogy's original male characters are safe from The Last Jedi's anti-male mentality. The treatment Poe received from Holdo is far from exclusive to him or even the heroes, which is why I assert The Last Jedi doesn't simply carry resentment against traditional heroes, but men in general. And so, the film's resentment of male characters even extends to General Hux. Villain decay is something that occurs when a villain goes from scary to little more than a joke, typically because they've been defeated so many times, or the heroes have so evolved past the villain's skill level that they barely represent a nuisance anymore. Not only does The Last Jedi prioritize Hux's villain decay, the movie makes his degradation the film's introduction. During Poe's infamous dreadnought plan, he infamously trolls Hux with silly antics. To quote, "Attention, this is Commander Poe Dameron of the Republic Fleet. I have an urgent communique for General Hux. Hux, this is General Hux of the First Order. The Republic is no more. Your fleet are rebel scum and war criminals. Tell your precious princess there will be no terms. There will be no surrender." Poe, "Hi, I'm holding for General Hux. Hux, this is Hux. You and your friends are doomed. We will wipe your filth from the galaxy." Poe, "Okay, I'll hold." Hux, "Hello?" Poe, "Hello? Yep, I'm still here." Hux, "Can you hear me?" Poe, "Hugs with an H. Skinny guy, kind of pasty." Hux, "I can hear you. Can you hear me?" Poe, "Look, I can't hold forever. If you reach him, tell him Leia has an urgent message for him about his mother." Well, I suppose there's some value in The Last Jedi's use of humor that's as infantilized as our target audience. It shatters Hux's credibility as a villain. In just a few minutes, Hux went from a threatening general training and inspiring his troops with terrifying fervor to a man-baby loser desperately trying to exude a persona he cannot hope to match. In fact, we see this with most major male characters in the film. Poe is trying to be the traditional masculine hero, taking charge, leading the fight against the enemy, and defying authority for the greater good. Yet, the film chastises him, belittles him, and tears him down at every turn. Finn tries to warn Rey that the First Order fleet will likely obliterate the Resistance fleet by the time she returns, but is knocked out and humiliated by Rose Tico. Kylo Ren wants to match the legacy of Darth Vader, but is also torn down and humiliated by Snoke. And even Hux tries to play the devious general who threatens the heroes with overwhelming and unstoppable power, only to be humiliated by both his enemies and Supreme Commander Snoke. When Hux isn't being shredded by Poe's Yo Mama jokes, he's being humiliated by Snoke in front of his men. A once villainous figure meant to carry menace, torn down because he's too scary for Rian Johnson's target audience of infected infantilized retards. But there's the rub. Defenders might say we're over-exaggerating the issue and simply excuse this as harmless humor. In Rian Johnson's own words, anyone who thinks that slightly goofy humor does not have a place in the Star Wars universe, I don't know if they've seen Return of the Jedi. So that's it, I suppose. It's just like the Return of the Jedi, with all those wacky Ewoks. However, the reality is, the presence of humor in a Star Wars movie was never the issue. It's how the humor was used. The original trilogy's humor, even at its worst, laughed with the audience rather than at the audience. Sure, the Ewoks seem silly, but let's take a look at the context and the consequence. Remember, the main conflict in Return of the Jedi revolves around our heroes landing on Endor in order to destroy the shield generator which protects the Empire's Death Star. That way, the Rebel fleet can destroy the superweapon before it's fully operational. To put it simply, the clock is ticking. So every obstacle Luke, Han, Leia, and Chewbacca encounter raises the tension. Like, for example, getting spotted by Imperial scouts, who if allowed to report back to the Empire, will ruin the Rebels' entire plan. What results is an intense speeder chase, which is what separates the group from Leia, causing them to look for her, and eventually gets them caught by Ewoks. First, let's take a look at that speeder chase, because I think it'll better illuminate the elements we'll get into with the Ewoks and the issue we faced with The Last Jedi. Luke and Leia are chasing down an Imperial scout. Luke jumps onto the scout's speeder and throws him off, and then we get a shot of the trooper hitting a big tree, likely killing him. This scene is admittedly humorous. Another trooper manages to shoot Leia's speeder, destroying it. Leia survives, but she's knocked out. The trooper, however, had divided so much of his attention on Leia that he couldn't see where he was going, and crashed right into a tree. And then finally, Luke Skywalker is forced off his speeder. The scout trooper comes back to finish Luke off. Luke pulls his lightsaber, blocks a few blaster bolts, and severs the front end of the scout's speeder, causing him to spin out of control and hilariously crash into a tree. So yes, Rian Johnson is technically correct when he says there's always been humor in Star Wars, but each example mentioned above is woven naturally into the events. Luke throws a scout off his speeder and he hits a tree. It shows you that the scout is permanently down, so you know he can't report back. It isn't overtly humiliating, and the scouts don't have a canned reaction or give a silly one-liner. He's just thrown off. The scout who shoots Leia has time to feel his victory for a moment before screeching to his death. It's funny, but it still makes sense. Leia pushes him to go too fast, and he eventually loses control. Again, it's not overtly humiliating or mean-spirited. We don't stop the movie as if to say, look everyone, it's time for the funny scene, which is a major characteristic of The Last Jedi. And then there's the moment Luke cuts the speeder and sends it spinning out of control. The spinning is humorous, but again, it's logical. And again, we only linger on it long enough to see the trooper's death. In short, we're not shown these scenes because they're funny. We're shown these scenes because they're necessary for the story. They just so happen to be funny. Now let's take a look at the Ewoks. What purpose did Hux's humiliation at the hands of Snoke serve other than just to humiliate him? He wasn't killed or demoted. No other purpose of the story was served other than to tear Hux down. Now let's take a look at the Ewoks. To summarize, Luke, Han, and Chewbacca are searching for Leia when they're captured by the tribal teddy bear creatures. The Ewoks treat Leia as a special guest, and C-3PO as some kind of god. They plan to eat Luke, Han, and Chewbacca in C-3PO's honor. Of course, Luke Skywalker uses the Force to convince the Ewoks that eating them is a bad idea, and they become allies against the Empire. Are the Ewoks a silly addition to a serious situation? Yes, maybe a little too silly. But remember how the humorous scenes during the speeder chase were simply out of necessity, rather than simply because they're funny? Believe it or not, the Ewoks are the same. The first major obstacle was to evade getting caught. Luke and friends made it through, but Leia was separated during the battle and she was taken in by the Ewoks. But these fluffy bear creatures aren't simply there to be goofy, or give the heroes some funny creatures to interact with like some kind of petting zoo. First, it makes sense for Endor to have natives. Second, after a minor conflict with a few scouts, how could the story raise the stakes without just alerting the Empire? Trouble with the tribal natives. People who have some home field advantage and an entire society they can use against our heroes. Narratively, they serve a similar purpose to the natives chasing down Indiana Jones after he snatched a sacred relic. Furthermore, the Ewoks and our heroes don't speak the same language, so having a simple discussion is out of the question. To make matters worse, time is on the clock, because the Ewoks plan to cook and eat our heroes, and the time for the Rebel fleet to attack the Death Star is drawing near. Fortunately, through some funny interactions combined with Luke's impressive mastery over the Force, they're able to convince the Ewoks to join them, giving the heroes a critical advantage for the native population against an occupying force. Now compare this to The Last Jedi's Lanai, who are the bird nuns taking care of the buildings on Ahch-To, or the Tit Monster, who serve no narrative purpose other than to fulfill Rian Johnson's disturbing fantasies. Again, the Ewoks don't simply exist to be cute or funny like the Lanai. They exist because they add to the movie's tension and affect the plot. They just so happen to be cute. So sure, the original trilogy has its moments, but they're either to serve the plot or add to the plot's tension. In other words, they have substance. Now, let's go back to Hux. He gets trolled. He gets dunked on with the Yo Mama joke. After Poe destroys an entire First Order ship, there's a reason why Hux expected to face his failure in private. Just like Poe's heroism, the movie tries to pin Hux's need for privacy on a fragile male ego, which is why the movie and Snoke delight in Hux's public humiliation. Snoke ends up disciplining Hux by slamming him on the ground and sliding him around in front of his men, degrading his character in the eyes of the audience and the eyes of his soldiers. Who's going to respect him after this? You might as well have just killed him at that point. Even Vader treated his men with more respect, like the moment when Vader arrived on the Death Star in Return of the Jedi to instill some discipline. Vader, you may dispense with the pleasantries, Commander. I'm here to put you back on schedule. Commander, I assure you, Lord Vader, my men are working as fast as they can. Vader, perhaps I can find new ways to motivate them. Commander, I tell you this station will be operational as planned. Vader, the Emperor does not share your optimistic appraisal of the situation. Commander, but he asks the impossible. I need more men. Vader, then perhaps you can tell him when he arrives. Commander, the Emperor's coming here? Vader, that is correct, Commander, and he is most displeased with your apparent lack of progress. Commander, we shall double our efforts. Vader, I hope so, Commander, for your sake. The Emperor is not as forgiving as I am. Vader would address his underlings by rank and with respect. Even when he delivered a warning, he didn't delight in humiliating his men or abusing them with power. Instead, he gave warnings, and when they failed, he gave his men ample time to correct that error before executing them for failure. To quote,
The fleet has moved out to flight speed and we're preparing to...
You have failed me for the last time, Admiral.
in other words, Vader didn't publicly slam his leaders into the ground and spin them around like a stooge to give the audience a cheap chuckle, because that chuckle would have come at the expense of the movie's integrity and the character's credibility. I mean, how does Hux's humiliation add to the story other than for a cheap chuckle? The scene only exists to degrade Hux's character and defang him as a villain. Again, he might as well be dead. In the grand scheme, all that happens otherwise is that Hux tells us that the Resistance fleet can't get away. Compare this to the Ewok scenes and the speeder chase, which showed us progression. The Last Jedi remains 1% story and 99% hot air. General Hux, the man leading the assault against the Resistance, should be intimidating. Even when taking losses, he should remain in control. In fact, this would help hammer home the lesson Poe was supposed to learn. Imagine this: Poe destroyed the Dreadnought, losing their bombers in the process, only for Hux to be confronted by Snoke, and Hux calmly assuring the Supreme Commander that everything is under control. The Resistance can't escape them, and it's only a matter of time before their total annihilation. Suddenly, a massive Resistance victory is struck meaningless. Then the audience could see Holdo and Leia's point. All those people were gone, yet Hux had calculated for it. In exchange for a cheap chuckle from Marvel's comedy slop trough, General Hux's reputation was shattered, his credibility as a villain shredded, and as a result, suffered terminal villain decay. The beginning of The Last Jedi utterly destroyed Hux as a villain, and he would never recover, which is probably why the writers decided to kill him off in The Rise of Skywalker. But in short, the speeder chase and even the Ewoks might have had humorous moments, but they ultimately raised the tension and elevated the narrative, while Hux's needless humiliation permanently hobbled the narrative. They are not the same. Finn suffered a similar fate. At least Hux got to be in charge for a while. Finn shows up in a puffy jacket leaking white fluid everywhere, and then he suffers the indignity of being tased by Rose Tico and getting dragged along the story by this annoying new character, who really only gets to lead, I suppose, because she's a girl. That is the only discernible factor that would put Rose Tico above Finn in the eyes of The Last Jedi. Finn was raised as a soldier. He helped infiltrate Starkiller Base and fought Kylo Ren. Rose Tico fixes pipes, but for some reason she's the one coming up with plans and leading the way. And why is Rose Tico the one who says they can track us to lightspeed, active tracking? Hyperspace tracking is new tech, but the principle must be the same as any active tracker. So they're only tracking us from the lead ship, but we can't get to the tracker. It's an A-class process. They'll control it from the main bridge. Finn, well, I mean, yes, but every A-class process has a dedicated power breaker. It's interesting how Finn is an awkward, stumbling clown until there's a woman around to be smart, and then he's finally allowed to be smart, but only smart enough to follow her lead. And after you're done asking yourself things like, why didn't Finn think of this? He literally mopped the room where the dedicated power breaker is located. Why only the lead ship? Why not every ship at once? Something that comes into play later, it seems, because while they build their entire plan on the premise, we just need to destroy the tracker and boom, problem solved, we later learn that the Resistance has a narrow window of only a few minutes to make the jump, before the First Order just starts tracking them with another ship. Which means Finn, Rose, and Poe put this plan together hoping that even if they infiltrate the ship and shut down the power breaker, Poe can somehow convince the entire Resistance fleet to jump to light speed at just the right moment. Or their entire plan falls to pieces. Brilliant. During the Canto Bight side quest, Finn and Rose end up rescuing a bunch of space horses to make a daring escape, and Finn doesn't even get the dignity of his own horse. He has to ride on Rose Tico's horse like a coy maiden, which means The Last Jedi both metaphorically and literally gives Finn the back seat in his own movie. Compare that to Luke taking a back seat on Leia's speeder, but still issuing orders, telling her what to do, before stealing a speeder of his own like a Chad. So both he and Leia are still important. But each time Finn is made a fool, each time he stammers out his awkward, nerdy dialogue, and without the movie paying this supposed hero even a moment's respect, his character is degraded in the eyes of the audience. Remember, Finn is a soldier. He was raised from childhood to serve the First Order, but he broke that conditioning. Realistically, his personality should stem from that experience, his core wound. If he's a jokester, or if he's awkward, it should have been the result of, or to cover up the pain of traumas past. However, by the time we get to the end, he's little more than a clown waiting for the next woman to lead him around by the metaphorical leash. First it was Phasma, then it was Rey, and now it's Rose Tico. Had the movies given Finn the proper respect, and if Disney didn't hate men so much, he could have been one of the most interesting characters in Star Wars history. Instead, he became the most pathetic. What other purpose would degrading Luke Skywalker, Poe, Hux, and now Finn serve other than lowering men to uplift the female characters? And if you still don't see The Last Jedi's vicious anti-male agenda, I ask, how does stripping Finn of all of his potential and lowering him into an utter clown serve the story better over giving him nuance, respect, growth, and allowing him to lead? So yes, Rian Johnson is technically correct about Star Wars having a touch of humor, which to me might be the reason Ahch-To, the planet Luke Skywalker fled to in the second movie in this trilogy, sounds so much like Act 2. It's just the right mix of smug, cringe, and hatred for Star Wars fans that gives it Rian Johnson's signature style. The original trilogy laughs with you, the prequels laugh down to you, and the sequels laugh at you. But few characters were given the same horrific level of dishonor as Kylo Ren. The sheer lost potential of his character dwarfs anything Finn ever lost, mainly because Finn never had much of a character past the first few lines of The Force Awakens, but also because The Last Jedi just hates men so much. And I know that's triggering to hear, and it seems undeniably hyperbolic, but I hammer home the claim once again because Kylo Ren is arguably the one who suffers most from the film's anti-male agenda. And as a major villain in The Last Jedi, the entire narrative suffers as a result. In fact, so many of the problems of the film could have been solved if the writers wrote Kylo Ren with respect rather than disdain. Here's what I mean. The Last Jedi begins by humiliating Hux, and when you finally catch up to Kylo Ren, he's being lectured by Snoke like a child, in what seems to be a stark motif of the film. Men are just children. Specifically, men are children who need women to show them the way to enlightenment. Luke Skywalker with Rey, Poe with Leia and Holdo, Finn with Rey and Rose Tico, and as we'll see, Kylo Ren with Rey. Unfortunately for Hux, he's a loser, and remains maidenless. So right after Hux's humiliation at Poe's hands, Kylo Ren must answer for his humiliation at Rey's hands from the last movie. What great villains. I can't wait to see what happens next. Is Poe going to steal Hux's lunch money? Is Finn going to dunk Kylo Ren's head in the toilet? Vader and Admiral Tarkin inspired fear every time they were on screen. Hux and Kylo Ren just inspire refunds. Snoke, the mighty Kylo Ren. When I found you, I saw what all masters live to see. Raw, untamed power. And beyond that, something truly special. The potential of your bloodline. A new Vader. Now I fear I was mistaken. Kylo,
I've given everything I have to you, to the dark side.
Snoke, take that ridiculous thing off. Yes, there it is. You have too much of your father's heart in you, young Solo. Kylo,
I killed Han Solo. When the moment came, I didn't hesitate.
Snoke, and look
look at you. The deed split your spirit to the bone. You were unbalanced, bested by a girl who had never held a lightsaber.
Even Snoke can't help pointing out how much of a Mary Sue Rey is. But the key moment here revolves around Kylo Ren's helmet. The film immediately reduces his mask from an intimidating icon of the First Order to a mark of fragility. When Snoke commands him to take off that ridiculous thing, the film takes Kylo Ren from a disciple of Darth Vader's legacy to a child playing pretend. And we're left asking the same simple question that haunts the waking dreams of every Last Jedi zealot. Why? Vader wore his mask in order to breathe. Why does Kylo Ren wear one? To emulate Vader, right? But why? And that brings us to the critical flaw of Kylo Ren's character. He doesn't have a tangible motivation. The Last Jedi treats the light side and the dark side, good and evil, with all the profound nuance of flipping a light switch. In Luke Skywalker's own words, I saw darkness. I sensed it building in him. I'd seen it in moments during his training, but then I looked inside and it was beyond what I have ever imagined. Snoke had already turned his heart. So Luke just sensed darkness building in him. Basically, if some melty-faced madman pumps you full of bad vibes, you just start slaughtering younglings, stabbing your own father, and blowing up planets. This is what happens when a modern art bro writes a movie. Just like how they can't comprehend someone being both a good person and hold even slightly different views of themselves, bad guys don't get motivations. Well, not unless the motivation is oppression or something. Giving a villain an understandable and logical reason why they turned evil means empathizing with that villain. And that's just unthinkable for Rian Johnson's stand-in for a raging man-baby incel. As much as sequel defenders point the finger of scorn at Lucas's prequel trilogy, the Clone Wars saga still gave us a prideful Anakin Skywalker who became disillusioned with the Jedi because he felt betrayed by them. Not only had the Council dishonored him, but they become decadent and prideful by the time the Clone Wars erupted. However, he ultimately fell to the dark side because he wanted the power to save his wife and children. The audience can understand and even empathize with Anakin's reasons. And this is what I mean when I say a villain is a hero who failed his temptation test. The character is a good person with a desire, and then evil grants that desire at the cost of his virtue. Even Luke Skywalker was tempted when it came down to protecting his friends. This is why he defied Yoda, traveled to Cloud City, and tried to defend his friends from the Empire. This, of course, resulted in his near death and the loss of Han Solo. Luke would also channel his hatred after Vader threatened Leia, and this is why Luke Skywalker tossed away his lightsaber. Because here, tossing away his weapon symbolizes tossing away his temptation. The path to hell is paved with good intentions after all. Anakin and Luke both desire to save their loved ones, so we can see the good intentions that sent them down their dark path. Now, why does Kylo Ren become evil? An important question to answer if we want Ben Solo to have an arc alongside Rey. Vader came pre-packaged as a veteran warrior and a titan of power. He personified the heights Luke Skywalker must eventually reach. The Empire Strikes Back especially showed us how much Luke had yet to grow. Kylo Ren, in comparison, is a villain in training still trying to perform his rites of passage, aka slaying his own parents. Having a villainous rival to outpace over a villainous master to overcome is fine, but this also means we need to dedicate time to the rival's growth as well. And this is where the lack of respect for Kylo Ren hits hardest. So again, why exactly does Kylo Ren become evil? We don't really get an answer. Some might say Ben Solo became Kylo Ren because Luke Skywalker tried to kill him as he slept. Well, let's remember what followed that event. To quote Luke, I went to confront him and he turned on me. He must have thought I was dead. When I came to, the temple was burning. He had vanished with a handful of my students and slaughtered the rest. We might understand why Anakin would betray the Jedi to save Padme. Over the course of 3 movies, Anakin experienced hypocrisy, arrogance, and betrayal from the Jedi. So we can at least somewhat understand why, when the choice arrived, he chose Palpatine over Mace Windu. The Jedi would reject his problems, while Palpatine and the dark side would offer solutions to his problems. In comparison, ignoring the severe character assassination the movie inflicts upon Luke Skywalker, we can understand and even empathize with Ben Solo's reaction to his uncle standing over him with his lightsaber at full mast. We understand why he'd try to kill Luke. However, it's another level of evil that pushes a man to kill the students he'd spent so many years training alongside and eventually kill his own parents. Just like Luke's sudden edgy boy phase, the film gives us no justification for Ben Solo's fall into Kylo Ren other than bad vibes. So in The Last Jedi, Rey gets to just be awesome and Kylo Ren gets to just be evil. No bias at all here. Kylo Ren's motivation, growth, and character moments are all sacrificed so he could Skype his crush, and so we could have more time with Rey sitting around on an island training herself, because heaven forbid she suffers the indignity of being trained by a a man. Some might say I'm asking too much, or they might ask, what's the alternative? It's easy to complain, but what's the solution? Well, on a character level, Rey and Kylo Ren have a very similar dynamic to Aang and Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Zuko is a rival to Aang, rather than an almighty standard like Darth Vader served for Luke Skywalker. In ATLA, Ozai served that purpose. In the first season, Zuko was an undeniable villain. Also, Aang and Zuko were arguably on equal footing skill-wise. Both had been trained all their lives in their nation's martial arts, Aang as an air nomad monk, and Zuko as heir to the Fire Nation throne. So it makes sense that they'd be around the same skill level. In Season 2, Aang found Toph to teach him earthbending, and Zuko underwent a journey of self-discovery, most notably Zuko Alone, where he separates from his mentor Iroh and faces some very difficult truths about his past, including the loss of his mother. Zuko would later face great temptation and fail. Towards the end of Season 2, it was a big question whether Zuko would go back to serving the Fire Nation or redeem himself by joining Aang. Zuko and Kylo both have a moment where they could turn against the evil Empire, but ultimately choose the evil Empire. Except the writers of ATLA respected its characters, so we know Zuko's motivations and we can see the shape of his character arc. In other words, we can see why Zuko made the choices he made. They fit within the logic of his character. At no point was his character or logic sacrificed simply to have a big moment. Zuko's big moments were set up, built up, and earned. In fact, at show's end, it was Zuko's battle against Azula that became the emotionally intense spectacle that even overshadowed Aang's battle with Ozai. In Season 3, Zuko's dishonorable act pushed him to throw away everything he thought he wanted. He'd betrayed his word and his self-respect, all to regain his princely title, his father's love, and his nation's respect. However, not only had he failed to regain his honor, he'd actively tossed it aside for all the wrong reasons. The Last Jedi should have been Kylo Ren's Zuko Alone moment, a moment where Kylo Ren undergoes a spiritual journey of self-reflection, where he questions his own choices, views, and moral allegiances. And yes, The Last Jedi did push Kylo Ren's internal conflict as a major conflict of the movie. To quote Rey, "You failed him by thinking his choice was made. It wasn't. There's still conflict in him. If he were turned from the dark side, that could shift the tide. This could be how we win." This is why Rey casually beats up Luke Skywalker and leaves in the Millennium Falcon. She defies Luke's wishes and drops into Kylo Ren's hands for the chance to save his soul. Honestly, the fact that Rey is even remotely close to Kylo Ren's power level, let alone his superior, is dishonorable enough. But modern audience writing tends to place emotion over logic. Emphasis is placed on big moments and emotional appeasement over verisimilitude, i.e. the story's ability to maintain the appearance of being true or real. Whether adherence to the lore or even common sense, verisimilitude is deemed unimportant, or at least tertiary to the film's message. A mindset that's frankly privileged. Who cares about the plot when you have themes? This is like appreciating a play but brushing off countless hours of practice behind the scenes or discounting the artistry dedicated to its development. There's nothing wrong with loving a play in the same way there's nothing wrong with a movie having big moments. But just as the rehearsals earn a magnificent play, a story's plot and underlying structure earns those big moments. The meaning and dramatic weight behind the scenes is what makes them memorable, rather than simply relying on size to dazzle us for a moment before we realize it was mostly empty. Modern writing delivers modern stories that are little more than empty calories devoid of narrative nutrition. Yet snobbish art bros pretending at intellectualism will praise this modern writing for the elusive modern audience. So we're told to admire narrative choices simply for being different or unexpected, discounting artistry for novelty. The writers portray Kylo Ren and Rey on the same level, call it a dyad in the Force, and are meant to call it genius, discounting the very logic that made Star Wars legendary in the first place was the hero's journey. The Force dyad cope is only there to excuse the lack of character development. Fans often point out that, logically, Rey shouldn't be as powerful as Kylo Ren because she didn't receive training, while Kylo Ren received training from not one but two masters. Even Snoke pointed this out. But in return, the fans were called sexist for hating their shiny new girl power character, and idiots for not appreciating the movie's genius. But the real issue fans are focusing on, whether they knew it or not, was the lack of character development. Character development is not just a way for writers to give characters powers. It's an avenue for the audience to know the character and see them grow. The Mask of Zorro has one of my favorite depictions of this, and I'd venture to say, is The Last Jedi done right. It has most of the major elements The Last Jedi strived for, but handled with respect. You have Alejandro, who's actually a nobody, had to become a bandit to survive, and couldn't fight with a sword because he, wait for it, didn't have training. You also get the old disillusioned mentor in Diego de la Vega, who has cast his life aside for a revenge. And failure is a prominent element in the story. Alejandro's brother was personally given a pendant as a child by his hero Zaro. Years later, not only is his brother dead, but Alejandro too failed to live up to the pendant's meaning, becoming a bandit rather than a hero. Diego, on the other hand, spent most of his life as a hero, fighting for the helpless and downtrodden, only to see his wife murdered, his house burned, his name erased, his freedom taken, and forced to sit helplessly in prison while his only daughter was raised by his mortal enemy. Alejandro even has a mortal enemy in Captain Harrison Love, after the good captain killed his brother, the one who was originally given the pendant by Zaro. Eventually, Alejandro meets Diego. Diego offers skills, knowledge, and training, so Alejandro may achieve revenge as well. We even get the legend of Zaro, but it's Alejandro who leans into the legacy, which then pushes him to pull off some crazy nonsense to steal a horse from the military, and it's Diego who chastises him for it. But one of the central pieces of the narrative is Alejandro's training. Through tests, extreme training, and lectures, we see Alejandro grow from a drunken thief who can barely swing a sword to a refined gentleman who can wield a blade with deadly precision. This is why training segments are so important, and this missing journey are what Star Wars fans were truly complaining about with The Last Jedi. Drunk or gentleman, we learn the kind of person Alejandro really is, and we watch his rough edges fade away until he's finally ready to wear the Mask of Zaro. If the Mask of Zaro were written in the same way The Last Jedi had been, and they didn't hate men so much, Alejandro would have taken a drink, fought a bunch of guys, and spouted a bunch of Marvel slop dialogue that takes you right out of the story. Well, that just happened. Smooth move, X-Lax. That could have gone better. And then maybe get some trading towards the end where he swings a sword around while Diego cries in the back. And at the end, he's able to defeat Captain Love for some reason. There's a reason why the hero's journey is so effective, why this tradition is the core structure of the original Star Wars trilogy, and why that story became so legendary. And it's the hero's journey along with its principles, which are exactly what Kylo Ren's story needed to logically work. So let's take Zuko and Alejandro's examples when we explore what could have been done with Kylo Ren had the writers respected the character. First, what's his motivation? As written, the answer is we don't actually know. But considering these quotes, it's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels, let it all die. And let the past die. Kill it if we have to. These are his most notable lines from The Last Jedi. And I think with these, we can reasonably reverse engineer a motivation. Kylo Ren hates the past. But why? Why would he hold such strong hostility for the past that he'd turn to the dark side? There are, of course, several ways to do this, but here, Ben Solo might begin as an idealistic young man who greatly romanticized the past. Luke Skywalker might even have been his childhood hero, and this could even connect to his later obsession with Darth Vader. Remember, the only information we get about Ben Solo before his turn to Kylo Ren is this one quote from Luke Skywalker: "I saw darkness. I'd sensed it building in him. I'd seen it in the moments during his training, but then I looked inside and it was beyond what I ever imagined. Snoke had already turned his heart. He would bring destruction and pain and death and the end of everything I love because of what he will become." A line that hints at an arc without ever giving us one. But what if they did? What if The Last Jedi did give us moments where Kylo Ren meditated, recalled his past, and reevaluated his views? Maybe we could cut out Canto Bight in his silly Skype calls with Rey and replace those scenes with something narratively relevant for a change. Maybe we could see Ben Solo's time as a happy child, obsessed with the Jedi's legacy, and who romanticized the legend of Luke Skywalker. How much joy he had being sent off to Luke's temple for training. I know it's been a while, but remember our discussion about All Quiet on the Western Front and the young soldier's desperate need to become admirable men? The same ambition would be in play for Ben Solo. Maybe he trains hard and finds certain talents, but he's not progressing as quickly as he thought. Some students even surpassed his skill level. How could this be? He has the blood of Skywalker pumping through his veins. Suddenly, Ben Solo is hit with the harsh reality that power isn't given, it's earned. He goes to his Uncle Luke and tells him his frustrations, and instead of an answer, all Ben gets is a story about Luke's own training, how he too struggled and overcame his own flaws to attain the heights he eventually attained. Ben Solo stops improving. He gets angry at every mistake, angry that so many other students are ahead of him. He even lashes out against students who wound him in training, and unleashes his frustrations at those who surpass him. And those frustrations continue to grow. Luke tells him to meditate. His anger is dangerous. He tells Ben that his behavior is not the Jedi way, but meditation is useless. All Ben can focus on is his failure and his rage. Rage at his uncle for failing him, rage at the Jedi for demonizing him, and rage at the students for surpassing him. And maybe this all culminates into one devastating moment, one Snoke had been waiting for. Ben Solo loses to his rival in a humiliating fashion, something he thought was impossible. He was strong in the Force, and better with a training saber than his rival, yet he's still lost. Ben Solo once again lashes out and has to be stopped by Luke Skywalker, and Ben walks off in fury. That night, Snoke tells Ben Solo about another way, the dark side. Ben is hesitant at first, but Snoke gives him the Palpatine speech, that the Jedi way is weak, that the dark side is demonized but not truly evil. In fact, it accepts Ben. Instead of condemning him to silence his rage, the dark side will teach him to use it. And as the crowning moment, Snoke tells Ben Solo about Anakin Skywalker and the legacy of Darth Vader, a Sith who turned his anger and pride into a nearly unstoppable force and forged a powerful legacy. Ben might see Luke as weak, a failure, a stark betrayal of the myth he worshipped as a child. The Jedi were blind, arrogant, cowardly, rather than the valiant heroes he imagined. Ben Solo's drive for greatness still burning strong, but now he reached for the true power of the Skywalker bloodline, the power he felt owed to him but robbed from him by fate. In short, Ben Solo began his training as an idealistic young man who felt like he was owed power thanks to his bloodline. His frustration led to anger, and his anger led him to Snoke. The dark side wouldn't order him to suppress his wrath or ambition, but to use them. And Snoke gave Ben Solo a new goal: become the next Darth Vader. Ben Solo had been sure of his choice until he killed his father and witnessed his mother die, events that shook his resolve. In the words of Snoke, "And look at you. The deed splits your spirit to the bone." His initial choices are to continue serving Snoke or redeem himself. Kylo Ren chooses the third option: kill Snoke and become the supreme leader, to end it all. Not just the Jedi Order and Luke Skywalker, but the Sith as well. After Snoke's lecture, the dark side hasn't really been any kinder to his needs and ambitions than the Jedi had, something that would organically lead us to this line:
It's time to let old things die. Snoke, Skywalker, the Sith, the Jedi, the Rebels, let it all die. Rey, I want you to join me.
Of course, Kylo Ren might have killed Snoke, but he only did so to satisfy his own ambitions. In other words, he didn't overcome his flaws. So of course, Kylo Ren would choose to side with the First Order even in our rewrite. But at least now we understand his motivations, his wants, and his flaws. The story we could have been given had the writers not been so focused on making him an angry incel who's just angry. Had they decided to take a cue from Zuko and have Kylo Ren reasonably grow alongside Rey, then take a cue from Alejandro and show us Kylo Ren changing from happy young man to an angry warrior desperately seeking greatness. But no, instead of giving us a deep dive into Kylo Ren's mental state and internal conflict, we got finger-wagging at capitalism and tit monster scenes. Fantastic. But all of that pales in comparison to the most recognizable sin of The Last Jedi, attacking the very heart of Star Wars, traditional heroism. The Last Jedi, however, not only subverts the ideals of traditional heroism, but poisons them. In other words, Rian Johnson actively denies heroes their moments of heroism, and even punishes them for their traditional heroic choices, especially if they're a man. Remember, Star Wars built itself on traditional masculine heroism, something that can be summed up in the archetypical tale of a young man who becomes a knight, slays a dragon, and saves the beautiful princess. Denial of heroism here refers to The Last Jedi's hatred of the traditional hero and especially masculine heroism. After all, it's the men who take the brunt of the finger-wagging, humiliation, and punishment for heroic deeds, something not only spiritually damaging, but narratively catastrophic. It's this attitude specifically that made the film feel so hostile to so many Star Wars fans. If you recall the earlier point, Luke Skywalker, like many young men, began a little egotistical. This is why we get this exchange. "Luke, I think those new droids are going to work out fine. In fact, I was also thinking about our agreement, about me staying on another season. And if these droids do work out, I want to transfer my application to the Academy this year." Owen, you mean the next semester before the harvest? Luke, sure, there's more than enough droids. Owen, harvest is when I need you the most. It's only one season more. This year we'll make enough on the harvest that I'll be able to hire a few more hands, and then you can go to the Academy next year. You must understand I need you here, Luke. Luke, but that's a whole nother year. Owen, it's only one more season. Luke, yeah, that's what you said when Biggs and Tank left. Looks like I'm going nowhere. He's enraptured by the romanticism of heroes past, and wants to attain that level of glory without comprehending the realities of such a journey. As a result, he puts together a princess rescue plan that nearly gets them killed and forces Obi-Wan to confront Darth Vader, which then ends in his death. This is the same starry-eyed ego that the older generation preyed upon to send legions of young men skipping off to the trenches and all quiet on the Western Front. However, by the time we get to the Return of the Jedi, Luke Skywalker has been through a journey of loss, pain, and growth. He's a mature hero who refined himself into a worthy Jedi Knight. But again, Disney Star Wars and The Last Jedi in particular don't value growth or change. If they did, Rey wouldn't have defeated Kylo Ren in The Force Awakens, and Rose definitely wouldn't have taken the lead over Finn in The Last Jedi. They both would have been required to earn their strength like Luke Skywalker earned his. So yes, when the fans complained about Rey and Rose, this was the true core issue. The writers showered their female heroes in free powers and prestige solely because of their gender, and yet it was the fans who were called sexist? The situation really was an IQ test, wasn't it? Instead of growth or change, modern writers tend to value emotional validation, messaging, and really big moments, all while chastising men for their heroics and giving us Rey, the ultimate Mary Sue who never had to work for a single thing her entire Star Wars career. She's just awesome, no growth required. Yet Rian Johnson had the audacity to run with the idea that men never change, that men never grow up, that every act of heroism is simply to sate their own ego, doing whatever glorifies themselves, rather than nobility or justice. With that in mind, it's not so surprising that a Star Wars film carrying commentary that only acknowledges half the truth in order to poison everything we loved about Star Wars was so divisive. The movie should have followed Finn as he grew into a character who could legitimately defeat Captain Phasma and heroically sacrifice himself for the Resistance. It should have followed Poe as he overcame his apparently impulsive nature and put together a thoughtful escape plan. It should have followed Rey as she learned from Luke Skywalker to attain the wisdom necessary to face Kylo Ren. But those very ideas are what The Last Jedi rallies against. The problem isn't that the film simply subverts expectations, it's that Star Wars was built on the hero's journey. So we, as the audience, expected heroes, and that's exactly where our expectations had been subverted. Let's take a look at Poe Dameron. Even though Leia was trying to call him off, his heroic dreadnought plan was a success. Not only did he humiliate General Hux in the process, his team annihilated a valuable First Order ship, and for this, Poe was yelled at and demoted. Now, the possible argument given by the film's defenders and the definite argument given by the movie is that Poe's actions were out of line because the Resistance lost their entire bombing fleet. A heavy cost paid so Poe could play hero. To quote General Leia, "Poe, get your head out of your cockpit. There are things you cannot solve by jumping in an X-Wing and blowing something up. I need you to learn that. Get your head out of your cockpit?" Very subtle, Ryan. And to recall Poe's exchange with Admiral Holdo, wasn't it Leia's last official act to demote you for your dreadnought plan, where we lost our entire bombing fleet? Poe, I want to know what's going on. Holdo, of course you do. I understand. I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you. You're impulsive, dangerous, and the last thing we need right now. So stick to your post and follow my orders. Poe's actions are exactly what a traditional hero would do. This is Riker defying a direct order because he trusted his own judgment and morality over Starfleet regulations. In fact, young Riker followed his captain's orders to the letter, even defending him against a mutiny. However, Riker's arc since his newbie days was actually realizing anyone can follow orders, but a true leader uses his own judgment. This is Luke Skywalker choosing to save Darth Vader rather than ending his reign. Luke had no idea if he could succeed, or what the repercussions would be. He just knew there was hope, and it was the moral thing to do. The Resistance fleet represented the very last of their group, as Holdo confirmed later on. We're the very last of the Resistance, but we're not alone. In every corner of the galaxy, the downtrodden and oppressed know our symbol, and they put their hope in it. We are the spark that will light the fire that will restore the Republic. That spark, this Resistance, must survive, which is empty corporate speak for, yeah, we're doomed. Poe pulls off a great heroic achievement against orders from the lead ship, and he gets no end of grief. To make things worse, both Holdo and Leia wag their fingers at our brave hero to make sure the audience knows he's wrong. Of course, the stated reason he's wrong is because it was dangerous and resulted in the loss of their bombing fleet, which is somewhat reasonable until we learn about their real plan. Now, it would be one thing if Leia and Holdo had a much better plan in mind. In fact, for Poe to be wrong and set up for a proper character change, proper story structure dictates that Poe's defiance of Leia directly jeopardizes a far grander plan. The clear path the movie grants us is the bombers. Maybe they were going to be used for a critical mission later on, and Poe got them all killed. Though even then, it wouldn't make any sense. If that were the case, why send all the bombers at once? But you get the idea. Poe defying Leia needed to result into a critical consequence so he can learn restraint. But those bombers were never part of any plan, and so their sacrifice for the destruction of a key First Order ship was reasonable. And that's why Poe's actions felt reasonable, rather than simple flyboy heroics. Remember, in A New Hope, Obi-Wan Kenobi told everyone to stay behind while he deactivated the tractor beam so they could escape the Death Star. But Luke Skywalker wanted to rescue the princess, so they enacted a half-baked yet daring rescue plan which set the whole station on high alert. All our heroes really had to do was sit tight, wait for Obi-Wan to return, and everything might have turned out relatively fine. In other words, Luke's bold actions put them all in danger and set the Death Star into high alert. Kenobi's plan didn't involve saving the princess, but it would have made sure his own crew escaped safely without alerting the Empire. At least not before they escape. When Luke is more mourning Obi-Wan's death, it's a harsh dose of reality. He'd taken his first steps outside those grand romantic fantasies, and like the young men who marched off to war with a smile, only to finally witness the horrors of the battlefield, Luke Skywalker learned how real his actions were, and how devastating the consequences can be. So while the princess was saved, lessons were learned. Poe Dameron's plan involved leading an attack on their pursuers. They lose their entire bombing fleet, but manage to destroy a dreadnought along with Hux's credibility. Leia, just for the record, Commander Dameron, I'm with the droid on this one. I should probably note here that BB-8 does not approve of Poe's plan. One thing that Holdo later glosses over is that Poe, in nothing but an X-Wing, single-handedly distracted the dreadnought long enough for the last of the Resistance fighters to escape the base below and join the fleet. And that's when Leia calls Poe off. Leia, you did it, Poe. Now get your squad back here so we can get out of this place. Poe, however, responds with this. No, General, we can do this. We have a chance to take out a dreadnought. These things are fleet killers. We can't let it get away. And then another pilot chimes in. Bombers, keep that tight formation. Fighters, protect the bombers. It's not every day we get a shot at a dreadnought, so make this count. So dreadnoughts are terrifying ships that can devastate bases from orbit and annihilate entire fleets. And remember, losing the dreadnought was destructive enough to deem Hux worthy of public humiliation. Its loss was obviously felt, so it would be especially advantageous to take away the dreadnought from their First Order pursuers. In the end, some small bomber ships lost in exchange for the First Order superweapon isn't a bad trade. A trade made all the better when they learned about lightspeed tracking, and the First Order discovered their base on Crate, which was their last line of defense. Now compare Poe's earlier words of heroism to Luke's words in A New Hope when he first saw the hologram of Princess Leia. Who is she? She's beautiful. Is there more of this recording? And his raging hormones would eventually lead Luke to his daring Death Star plan. Remember, even Captain Picard saw value in an officer thinking for himself, relying on his own judgment over blind obedience. Poe's words and actions in comparison to Luke's are strategic and calculated. The Resistance's situation is life and death. If they can take down a First Order dreadnought, it's best to take that opportunity, especially if their end goal is to hold up in a rickety old base. Poe isn't trying to be a hero. He's putting his life on the line to give the dying Resistance its best chance. When we learn the First Order can track the Resistance fleet through lightspeed, Poe's instincts seem fairly on point. And Holdo's brilliant strategy? Just keep driving and allow the fleet to dwindle down into nothing. Or in Poe's words, we had a fleet. Now we're down to one ship and you've told us nothing. Tell us we have a plan, that there's hope. So to summarize, Poe's plan involved leading a desperate fleet into impossible victories against an overwhelming force. And for this, Poe is chastised, demoted, and torn down for his trouble. To recall Holdo's words, I've dealt with plenty of trigger-happy flyboys like you. You're impulsive, dangerous, and the last thing we need right now. So stick to your post and follow my orders. Why is an admiral acting so insecure? And at their most desperate hour, all Holdo can offer is, when I served under Leia, she would say hope is like the sun. If you only believe in it when you can see it, you'll never make it through the night. This is Holdo's response to Poe begging to have some sort of assurance. They don't need platitudes. They need a plan. First of all, Poe isn't even asking for the plan's details. He just needs to know if there is one. So when the fleet is down to one ship and the Resistance is hanging on by a thread, we can empathize with Poe's frustrations. Rather than provide hope, her response is to have everyone hope that there's hope. Second of all, there are accusations that Poe might have been a spy, which is such a ridiculous notion considering he just destroyed a dreadnought. But even if Poe had been a spy, Holdo's actions are suspect. You'd think the Admiral will be issuing orders and putting maneuvers into play instead of letting every ship die off. Poe might have lost their bombers, but at least they were allowed to put their doomed lives to better use. Under Holdo, they simply ran out of fuel, evacuated some of the crew, and let the First Order destroy them. Why not siphon fuel from the other ships? Why not have a group of doomed ships driven by skeleton crews and minimal fuel turn back and slow down the First Order? Something they kind of do later on at Crate. There's an episode of Star Trek DS9 titled Once More Unto the Breach that found a squad of Klingon warriors in a similar situation. A few ships led by General Martok carried out a quick hit-and-run operation against the Dominion. However, a number of Dominion ships gave pursuit. It was only a matter of time before they overtake our heroes. Fortunately, Kor, the disgraced legendary warrior, took one ship manned with volunteers and flew back to distract the enemy long enough for the others to escape. Kor and his crew were killed, but he delayed the enemy so long the others made it to safety. Classic male heroism at play. The same heroism constantly belittled by the Last Jedi. So, why is Admiral Holdo slinging stupid platitudes rather than making Admiral-level choices like those? Is it really better to let everyone limp along and die, rather than have a group form an organized attack against the enemy? She's supposed to be a legendary Admiral after all. Admiral Akbar gave you action over Endor. Holdo gives you platitudes in a slow, agonizing death. This is why they're failing. Napoleon, Hannibal Barca, Caesar, Alexander the Great, all say the great tacticians of their pasts. They had generations of wisdom from dozens of battlefields burned into their minds. All the resistance leaders apparently have are self-help books and yesterday's drunk tweets. Poe has every right to be angry. Does it really take a genius admiral to just say, keep driving? So when Poe conducts a mutiny, we can empathize, because all he's been told was to abandon ship and keep running away in smaller, unguarded ships. All Holdo did was lead the fleet to ruin. The mutiny technically should have been a big heroic moment, but of course, Poe is in the wrong. Rian Johnson would rather crush every facet of heroism rather than tell a sensible story. Poe's mutiny, however, is eventually thwarted by girl boss Holdo, and Poe himself is stopped by Leia. They treat Poe and crew like babies throwing little tantrums and move on. Aren't they cute? I suppose that attitude isn't surprising considering Poe is a man in a Rian Johnson movie. Fortunately, Holdo decides to stay behind so he can mercifully put this insufferable character out to pasture. Leia begs her to stay, and we're supposed to feel sorry for a character we just met and whose only contributions have been to belittle the main characters and enact her big-brained escape plan. And the big plan? Go to Crate and hide out, hoping there's enough power to contact your allies and that your allies will respond, which they eventually don't. Leia, Holdo knew the First Order was tracking our big ship. Big ship, really? What is this baby dialogue? They're not monitoring for little transports. Little transports? Who wrote this? Also, why aren't they looking for transports? Doesn't the First Order want them wiped out? Remember, Leia says they're not monitoring for transports, not that the transports are undetectable. Even the Empire was searching for escape pods in A New Hope. Why would the First Order's technology and tactics be worse now? It all seems like another moment of convenient answers handed to the main characters because theme takes preference overall, and having things make sense doesn't really matter in a Star Wars movie. A notion you can't both claim to hold and retain credibility as a storyteller or media critic. In any logical universe, Poe would say that's stupid. Why would she think they're not looking for little transports? Why would the First Order think people trying to run away wouldn't try to run away? So the glorious plan hinged everything on the ridiculous certainty that the First Order wouldn't consider a resistance facing certain death to try fleeing. But it was a woman's plan in The Last Jedi, and therefore was the right option. And Poe was just stupid for thinking escape pods would be tracked. And as a final slap to the face, Leia, of all people, gives Poe this line. She was more interested in protecting the light than she was seeming like a hero. Remember when I said The Last Jedi sees men, and male heroes especially, as selfish man-babies who place their own egos above all else? This is probably the second most overt display of that mentality. Every move Poe makes is calculated. He's not a starry-eyed young hero looking for glory. And most of all, his plan hurt the First Order. Under Poe, the dying rebels were trading blows with the enemy. Being a hero was just a consequence of saving the day. From Picard, to Riker, to Core, to the destruction of the Dreadnought. Why does The Last Jedi make Poe the face of traditional masculine heroism and then treat him like a child throwing a tantrum? I mean, why does The Last Jedi treat Poe this way if the goal isn't to demonize masculinity and traditional heroism? Finn arguably suffers just as bad or worse than Poe. Remember, Finn lacked courage in The Force Awakens. This is why he so often ran away, unless he absolutely had to face his problems, unless it concerned Rey. Her natural Mary Sue-ish aura was so great that even Finn was able to temporarily overcome his flaw to save Rey at Starkiller Base. But his fear isn't something he truly conquered yet. Also remember, Finn was wounded on Starkiller Base during his rescue attempt, so he hasn't had the chance to face his demons. Once again, The Last Jedi should have followed Finn, as he changed from someone who'd run away and into someone who sacrificed himself for the Resistance. But the film steals every moment that should have been Finn's and gives it to Rose Tico. You see, in the grand scheme of The Last Jedi, it's Finn and Rose who are handling the traditional portion of a Star Wars movie. After Poe's grand entrance, he spends most of the movie just waiting around on the ship, and Rey spends most of her time on ice waiting for Luke Skywalker to do something. It's Finn and Rose who are the ones going off adventuring. They come up with plans, they fly to Canto Bight in search of a codebreaker, they tangle with guards, they get tossed in jail, go on a chase, infiltrate a First Order ship with Dr. Gonzo, and have a daring battle against Captain Phasma. However, every time our alleged heroes get a moment to be heroic, the plot fairy hands them a way out. First, we learn that lightspeed tracking is the newest major conflict. Normally, we'd follow the protagonist as they try to solve this issue, except that would give us a fun story full of heroic adventure. And all that heroism would get in the way of all the intellectualism going on. So Finn, on his way to warn Rey, meets a new character named Rose Tico, who happens to just know all the answers. They can track us through lightspeed, active tracking. Hyperspace tracking is new tech, but the principle must be the same as any active tracker. So they're only tracking us through the lead ship, but we can't get to the tracker. It's an A-class process. They'll control it from the main bridge. That's an impressive line of reasoning reasoning and knowledge considering Rose just works on pipes all day. You're Finn, the Finn. Sorry, I work behind pipes all day. Doing talking with Resistance heroes is not my forte. Now, Rose's knowledge on the topic is an issue, but not a serious one. It could have been hand-waved away by specifically noting that she was forced to serve as an engineer on a First Order ship. In fact, this could be why she's so dedicated to her job, and why she's stuck working on pipes. The people in charge might see her as a potential spy, so gave her duties far below her skill level, away from sensitive information. And Rose is trying to prove her loyalty by carrying out her tasks regardless of circumstance. The real issue is everything else. Finn was caught fleeing to warn Rey that the First Order can track the Resistance through hyperspace, so the plot fairy just boops a solution into existence in the form of Rose Tico. And note, Rose isn't there to help Finn discover a solution. She's there to hand him one. Finn just mentions hyperspace tracking and Rose pops up with the answer. In short, it isn't earned. So logically we ask, why didn't anyone else think of it? Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, and Columbo all stand out as genius detectives in their respective universes because they consider what no one else considers, questions what no one else questions, and therefore make logical conclusions no one else can make. Rose's logic amounts to hyperspace tracking exists, therefore it must operate the same way as normal tracking. Therefore, it can be shut down in the same way. Rose didn't make small connections others missed or uncover something unusual. There was no investigation. She just made connections based on general knowledge any engineer should have. Realistically, almost anyone on board should have informed Holdo about the situation. And logically, the Codebreaker plan should have been Finn's plan. If he wanted to keep his internal conflict, then have him delay on his way out. Should he carry out the plan as directed or run away to warn Rey? Not only did Rose Tico's inclusion prevent our heroes from doing actual work, but it robbed Finn of purpose. When I said Rose Tico's deduction would make far more sense if she'd been a First Order minion, Finn actually had been one. He should have been the one to explain how lightspeed tracking worked and put together the hypothetical plan to infiltrate the First Order and disable its function. So the Resistance would have two plans in play, Holdo's plan and Finn's mission. After all, in a situation as desperate as this one, it might be a good idea to have several avenues for survival. And it's here I wonder, for what reason was Finn robbed of a heroic moment rightfully his? I mean, why humiliate Finn if the goal wasn't to belittle men, emasculate male heroes, and demonize traditional heroism? To further the point, Finn is seen as a hero by Rose until she realizes he's trying to leave. But you're a hero. You left the First Order. What you did on Starkiller Base, when we heard about it, my sister Paige said, "Rose, that's a real hero. Know right from wrong and don't run away when it gets hard," she said. This dialogue is so cringe. Of course, Finn was trying to run away, oddly enough, so he's then knocked out and humiliated. That's when Finn and Rose bond over technobabble, which eventually turns into their Codebreaker plan. This might seem like an earned deduction, but it isn't. They're just blurting out answers. They pulled the same trick in Force Awakens when they tried fixing the Falcon. It's supposed to make them seem knowledgeable, but vomiting up technobabble doesn't make a character seem smart. The reason why Sherlock Holmes, Hercule Poirot, and Columbo seem so impressive is because we're shown the clues and circumstances. And where we generally see a mess, they see pieces to a puzzle, and they link those pieces together by logic. Hercule Poirot, for example, will immediately identify strychnine as a deadly poison used in a murder. This makes him knowledgeable, but not only figuring out how the murderers used the poison, but also that they left behind fake clues so that the suspect would be tried and cleared of all charges so he can enjoy the benefits of double jeopardy, and therefore Poirot did everything he could to prevent the suspect from going to trial too early, makes Poirot seem intelligent. Lieutenant Columbo once broke a killer's alibi by going over a speech he wrote and noting that part of the speech included references to world news that had broken 6 hours after the killer had supposedly written the speech, and therefore he wasn't busy writing the speech that evening, he was busy murdering the victim. Again, the functions of a hyperspace tracker seem like common knowledge. Our heroes need a plan only they can piece together. They need to earn that plan. A New Hope gave us steal the Death Star plans, which became the movie's inciting incident, and blow up the superweapon, which was the final confrontation. Easy, simple, and clean. The Last Jedi gave us technobabble and some plan we guess might make sense to at least Finn and Rose, and apparently anyone else who has even remote knowledge on how starships work. A normal story might give us a problem to solve, what the heroes need to do to solve it, and then watch them earn their victory. The Last Jedi required a codebreaker, and Maz Kanata just tells them where to find one. And apparently the man is just always gambling on Canto Bight like some kind of NPC. These are not the same. When they get to Canto Bight, Rose takes the lead. Why? She cleans pipes all day, while Finn is a hero and a former soldier. Not only is Finn robbed of strong character moments, but every moment that should have gone to Finn's essential character development gets eaten up by Rose Tico like some sort of vestigial digital twin. For example, Rose gets to dump her stupid backstory about how she and her sister grew up in a poor mining system, and how the First Order took all their ore and tested their new weapons by shelling them. Obviously, this should have been Finn's moment. He's the one who needs strength to face Phasma. He's the one who needs to face certain death for his friends. He's the one who needs a character arc, not Rose. In other words, it's Finn who needed the moment of self-reflection. Maybe remember where he came from. What can he remember from his childhood? How did the First Order find him? What did they do to him? In fact, we could have gotten both backstories. Rose recalling her past could have prompted Finn to talk about his own. Maybe explore a new depth to his character we haven't seen, and even get a whole new perspective on who Finn is, other than a hopeless goofball. And as we learn more about who he was and who he is now, Finn can open himself up to major, permanent growth. In any other story, this is exactly what would have happened. But The Last Jedi doesn't have time for men. Men are simple, worthless cavemen who women bravely tolerate while they get the real work done. The Force is female, after all. So Rose Tico, this absolute worthless character, gets to share her backstory, and then we move along. No time for Finn. It would be one thing if Rose Tico grew up on Canto Bight, served there, or had any connection at all, but she doesn't. She's just as disconnected from the planet as Finn. So why not give Finn the spotlight? The whole planet is childishly absurd. Really? Only one job will get you rich enough to be there? Weapons dealing to the First Order? This is the kind of logic you'd come up with when you're a kid, playing with your friends on the playground. In the entire galaxy, with countless races, needs, wants, supplies, planets, that's the one thing that gets you rich enough for Canto Bight? This is why you shouldn't get your movie scripts from Reddit. From here, you'd think our heroes would get back to work, find the master codebreaker Maz Kanata told them about. But this is The Last Jedi, a Rian Johnson movie. So BB-8 just finds the guy off screen, while Rose was busy shaking her fist at capitalism. Why waste screen time on heroes doing things? So let's just have the problems solve themselves. Exciting! But unfortunately for Finn and Rose, they parked their car wrong, and now they're headed to jail for unpaid tickets. But now they have to figure out how to escape, find the codebreaker, and convince him to help before the Resistance fleet runs out of fuel. Finally, a little bit of tension. Once again, we have the perfect setup for heroism, a problem our characters have to solve. Now one might say, see, the problem wasn't solved for them. Really? This is a Rian Johnson movie after all. So Finn and Rose happen to find a different master codebreaker in the jail cell they're thrown in. Rian Johnson purposefully taking already absurdly childish writing and giving it brain damage. They just so happen to find a super hacker in the same kind of cell that key people who parked incorrectly. Johnson took away the codebreaker, actually giving us a problem and a little bit of tension, just to hand a codebreaker right back. Some might say it's not the same since the new guy betrays them. However, keep in mind that Maz Kanata's master codebreaker spends every waking second gambling in Canto Bight, which the film just finished explaining to us in the most Reddit way possible is the den of capitalist pigs. Would Maz Kanata's codebreaker really have been more trustworthy? Though I'd like to think they just ended up in the same cell as Dr. Gonzo from Fear and Loathing, like he'd been arrested for possession of 5 sheets of high-power blood or acid, a salt shaker of cocaine, and a whole galaxy of multicolored uppers, downers, screamers, laughers, and this movie was about to get a whole lot better. But of course, Finn and Rose face another dilemma: how to escape before the Resistance fleet gets annihilated. Finally, a chance for Finn to be a hero. After all, he had been a soldier. Guarding cells was likely his job at one point, and he might use his insight to piece together an escape plan, which would be cool. But this is The Last Jedi, a narrative which acts more like a butler than a story. Your solution, sir? Obviously, Dr. Codebreaker just hacks the door with a chip and walks out for some reason. Once again, a problem solved for the characters rather than allowing them to heroically figure out the answer and make a daring escape. And what about the prison guards, you ask? Surely they might pose a challenge to our unarmed heroes. Oh, don't worry, BB-8 took care of it. Again, off screen. Fantastic. Because only dumb boys think being a hero is cool. It's one thing to take a big sloppy ladle from the fetid trough of Marvel humor, but it's another to use that slop to solve a major conflict. Imagine if A New Hope had Luke, Han, Chewie, and Leia trapped in that hallway, Han and Luke muttering how they're doomed and there's too many troopers, only for Leia to roll her eyes, sigh, take Luke's gun, and shoot all the stormtroopers. Then she'd hand back the gun or something to a dumbfounded Luke and say something like, "You call this a rescue?" And then Leia would smugly walk away. And of course, Han would say something emotionally validating like, "Oh, I like her." Luke and Han had to kill a few guards and steal some uniforms to blend in on the Death Star. Then they had to put together a plan to rescue Leia from prison. Then they had to shoot their way out, something that led to them being nearly crushed by a trash compactor, and finally ended in Obi-Wan Kenobi's death. But Canto Bight? A super hacker just opens the door for them. BB-8 defeats all the guards for them, and there happens to be a sewer entrance to provide an escape for them. A sewer that leads them all the way outside of jail, and they end up at the horse stable. Heroes handed answers to every problem so they don't have to be heroes at all. To quote Wesley, "The Last Jedi is garbage, Highness. Anyone who says differently is selling you something." At least, I'm pretty sure that's how that went. Finn, Dr. Code, and Rose stop to figure out the next step. Fortunately, they're in a Rian Johnson movie, so no one really has to do any work. Finn just asks, "Those cops will be here any minute. What now?" To which the stupid space horses agree to help them escape. Problem solved. A chase scene follows, but nothing of consequence actually happens, other than Finn's further humiliation when this hero and former soldier has to take a literal back seat to Rose Tico. I mean, we can't even have Finn ride his own horse. He has to ride as Rose Tico's passenger. Why is he even here? So in the end, Rose and Finn free the herd of domesticated animals to die horrible deaths in the wilderness instead of having shelter, food, and teams of people taking care of their every need. One might think we'll get some tension. Their ship exploded, and the two champions of the Republic are left waiting for the authorities to kill them. Behold, yet another chance for Finn to be a hero. Think of a way to fight, evade, or escape the minions of Canto Bight. Oh, never mind, this is a Rian Johnson movie. So of course, Dr. Code arrives on his ship to once again hand Finn and Rose the answer to all their problems. Probably should thank BB-8 too, since this is technically another situation he solves off screen. But after all that trouble and all that buildup, The Last Jedi delivers one of the most insulting strikes to the very heart of Star Wars. Finn, Rose, and Dr. Code infiltrate the First Order ship, and they are immediately captured. Rose and Finn are sentenced to be executed, and the Codebreaker traded knowledge of the Resistance escape plan to the First Order in exchange for his freedom and money. So to recap, the daring, impossible, traditionally heroic plan that was built up as the only true hope for the Resistance, encapsulated most of the action, and has been the only storyline actually moving forward, fails. Even Finn's victory against Phasma was empty. First of all, Finn wasn't allowed a character arc. Had Finn matured and overcome some personal demon before facing Phasma, there might have been some meaning, and his victory over her would be symbolic proof that he'd finally overcome the past trauma she represents. Second, Phasma was never introduced until the Codebreaker plan failed. We didn't even know she was alive until that moment. In short, her presence was ultimately meaningless to the plot. What pain did the First Order suffer from her death? Snoke's death left the Order leaderless. Even General Hux's death would leave the Order without someone to lead the chase. Phasma, however, served no purpose. So yes, Finn may have won, but his victory neither signaled character growth nor did it advance the plot. Remember, Poe spends most of his time watching the Resistance fleet crumble under Holdo's command until he pushes a mutiny. A mutiny is not a glorious thing. It's an action an officer only takes if he's absolutely certain, just like with Riker, that a mutiny against a morally bankrupt leader would be the right action. So it's not exactly rescuing princesses or slaying dragons. Mutiny, right or wrong, is a filthy business. In short, Poe wouldn't mutiny so he'd look like a hero. He likely knew his career was over. He might even be executed. But Finn and Rose were out of time. The Resistance was hanging on by a thread, and all Holdo had to offer, after all of her attitude and platitudes, was the command to abandon ship and flee in small, vulnerable vessels. All while the massive First Order looms over them. This plan makes no sense. Why would anyone keep trusting Holdo at this point? Ideally, this should have been Poe's big character moment, the completion of his arc. He, hypothetically, begins as a brash, blaster-happy flyboy. That brashness leads to his mutiny, and his defeat, coupled with Holdo's sacrifice, would show him the folly of his ways, ultimately signaling his character growth. And this is something Finn should have experienced leading up to Phasma. Finn should have had an arc, pushing his character to overcome his flaws, his past, and ultimately his greatest foe. This way, their battle and Phasma's defeat would signal Finn's victory over the man he used to be. But without an arc, and all the setup and introspection we'd see along the way, Phasma's defeat, once again, meant nothing. In short, Poe made all the moves of a traditional hero and failed. Finn departed on a near impossible quest to shut down the Order's hyperspace tracking to give the Resistance a fighting chance, and also failed. And not only failed, the film adds insult to the injury by having the Codebreaker, an ally recruited specifically for the mission, alert the First Order about the transport plan, effectively dooming the Resistance and stealing away any chance of survival they had. So Poe's heroic actions, his mutiny, and all of Finn's efforts resulted in failure. And not just ordinary failure, where they tried their best to save the day but simply couldn't. Like a knight dying to the dragon and dooming the princess to her fate. It's much worse than that. Because according to the film, had Finn and Poe simply sat back and done nothing, Holdo's plan would have just worked, and the Resistance would have been saved. Had the men just sat back, not tried to be traditional heroes, and simply let the women take the lead, everything would have worked out. This is the film's true theme. What is The Last Jedi about is failure. The movie and its many defenders seem to fetishize this failure. But failure alone isn't the theme. Just the idea of failure doesn't really convey an artistic message or expression. What about failure is important? Where's the artistic expression? The answer to this question is the true expression of the tale. So, therefore, the theme of The Last Jedi isn't simply failure, but men's failure. The supposed flawed nature of traditional masculine heroism. And lastly, Finn's final humiliation is sealed by Rose Tico. The First Order sent in a battering ram to break open the last Resistance stronghold. Once that happens, they're doomed. This is when Finn decides to heroically sacrifice himself to destroy the battering ram and save his friends. They tell him to pull back, but he refuses. To quote, "No, I won't let them win." After 2 movies, finally, Finn's life will have changed from serving as a First Order soldier and into the savior of the Resistance. Finally, after being robbed of every heroic moment so far, Finn will accomplish something above and beyond, something meaningful. He can finally be a hero. But of course he doesn't get the chance. Finn's a man, remember? We can't have a man saving the Resistance. This is a Rian Johnson movie, and heroism is stupid. And we can't have a man doing anything heroic, at least not without the movie yelling at him for it. So Rose Tico swoops in and bashes Finn out of the way, preventing his heroic sacrifice and dooming the Resistance. At least that's what happens both logically and objectively. But of course, Rose is written as correct, and Finn as in the wrong, somehow. To quote Rose Tico, "I saved you, dummy. That's how we're going to win. Not fighting what we hate, saving what we love." The Last Jedi once again tells us that traditional masculine heroism is simply a product of a dangerous ego. The entire movie centers around how correct Holdo is for not wanting to seem like a hero, and that male heroism is driven by ego, and that ego leads to ruin. This is Kylo Ren's pride and baseless rage. This is Poe's aggressive actions against the enemy, and this is Finn's codebreaker plan. Objectively, most of the movie was a waste. Poe and Finn's nobility counted for nothing. They weren't even granted the dignity of having their failures carry meaning. They didn't have to succeed completely, but what their heroic actions did accomplish could have given some reprieve or advantage or saved lives, or at least ended in a completed arc, having them earn maturity or some kind of change in their characters. But that's not what happened. Rather, their efforts were ultimately detrimental, and this is why The Last Jedi is so insulting. The movie is trying to tell us that the male heroes are suffering the consequences of selfishness and arrogance. This is why Leia praises Holdo for not trying to be a hero. However, Poe, Finn, and even Rose only ever acted out of heroic nobility. Everything they did was to ensure the survival of the Resistance against terrible odds. Poe risked his life and potentially ruined his reputation to defend his allies. Finn worked against his instinct to flee and bravely decided to enact the suicidal codebreaker plan. Therefore, in the end, the movie wasn't punishing Finn and Poe for selfish or egotistical actions. The movie was punishing them for being noble. The heart of Star Wars has always been male heroism, a young man's journey towards greatness. But The Last Jedi not only denies us the lifeblood of the franchise, what we loved about it to begin with, but despises it. Again and again, we're shown hints of heroism only for the movie to tell us that this is wrong or selfish. According to The Last Jedi, it's best not to even try. Ironically, in order to demonize male heroism, Rian Johnson had to give us heroes, which he did with Finn and Poe. But traditional heroes are so fundamentally human and ingrained in our very nature, all we saw were heroes acting righteously being painted as egotistical and selfish by the film. Poe was wrong for taking action. The correct answer was to trust Leia and Holdo. Finn was wrong for taking action. The correct answer was to trust Leia and Holdo. Rey, however, was wrong for trusting Luke Skywalker, and the correct answer was to take action. Really, the correct answer is that men are always wrong. But what do you mean Rey was wrong to trust Luke? Someone might ask. Well, this one is a little more complicated than it sounds, but it does lead us to the next point. Perhaps The Last Jedi's most malicious attack was its shameless degradation of the Jedi. Luke Skywalker plays a disillusioned old master and later Rey's reluctant mentor, but he also seems to play as Rian Johnson's personal mouthpiece. When Luke finally agrees to teach Rey, he chooses to limit his training into 2 lessons. Neither are actual lessons, and both illustrate Luke's sudden resentment of the Jedi Order. Lesson 1. That Force does not belong to the Jedi. To say that if the Jedi die, the light dies is vanity. Can you feel that? Lesson 2. Now that they're extinct, the Jedi are romanticized, deified. But if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris. At the height of their power, they allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader. A New Hope described the Jedi Knights as heroes. More importantly, the Jedi were the valiant guardians who Luke sought to become. His growth and guidance under two Jedi Masters led to his final defiance against the Emperor. "I'll never turn to the dark side. You failed, Your Highness. I am a Jedi like my father before me." In Luke's own words, he had aspired to be a hero like his father had been, and his journey towards Jedi Knight helped him achieve not just his dreams, but his full potential. And so Luke became a hero. Star Wars is full of fighter pilots, smugglers, and bounty hunters, but the Jedi were the ultimate Star Wars fantasy. Not only did they get a lightsaber and supernatural powers, but they were the heroes. In the famous words of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic, before the Dark Times, before the Empire. If the narrative and theme of Star Wars were guided by traditional masculine heroism, then the Jedi were the personification of that tradition. They were the valiant knights who served the realm under the Camelot that was the Old Republic. So, of course, The Last Jedi dedicates its narrative to degrading this most sacred order, and it does so with the very voice of Luke Skywalker. "I will never train another generation of Jedi. I came to this island to die. It's time for the Jedi to end." But again, this isn't the optimistic hero he followed in the original trilogy. Sure, he was more cynical by the time we reach Return of the Jedi, but he was still heroic enough to risk his life for the galaxy, and optimistic enough to defy Obi-Wan for that slight hope of redeeming his father. And I am not alone in this view. Here's what Mark Hamill had to say.
I said to Ryan, I said, Jedis don't give up. I mean, even if he had a problem, he would maybe take a year to try and regroup. But if he made a mistake, he would try and right that wrong. So right there, we had a fundamental difference. But it's not my story anymore. It's somebody else's story. And Ryan needed me to be a certain way to make the ending effective. That's the crux of my problem. Luke would never say that. I'm sorry. Well, in this version, see, I'm talking about the George Lucas Star Wars. This is the next generation of Star Wars. So I almost had to think of Luke as another character. Maybe he's Jake Skywalker. He's not my Luke Skywalker.
A hero who doesn't give up, who does what's right and rights his own wrongs. This is Luke Skywalker. This is the hero Mark Hamill played. And this is the hero generations of fans fell in love with. A man who witnessed the charred remains of his aunt and uncle, who saw his mentor cut down in front of him, felt the loss of friends during the war, and sat at Yoda's side as the old master passed away. A hero who had discipline enough to look evil in the eye and toss aside his lightsaber rather than allow his emotions to drive him to temptation. Yet The Last Jedi expects us to believe that the man who nearly killed his own nephew, abandoned his friends, and sought the destruction of the Jedi is the same hero. At this point, we can see why Mark Hamill and legions of Star Wars fans saw TLJ's Luke Skywalker as not just out of character, but as another character entirely. The Last Jedi's Luke Skywalker isn't Luke at all. He's Rian Johnson in a Luke Skywalker skin suit, bashing the Jedi. And this is why when I say Luke Skywalker, I mean Luke Skywalker from the original trilogy, while TLJ's version of him could only be Jake Skywalker. And so when I say The Last Jedi tells us Rey was wrong to trust Luke Skywalker, I mean Luke Skywalker, and not Jake. A very critical difference. To see what I mean, let's go over Jake's lessons, shall we? Lesson 1. That Force does not belong to the Jedi. To say that if the Jedi die, the light dies is vanity. The Jedi were the guardians of peace and justice. They sought out the Force sensitive to guide them towards their full potential and away from the dark side. When was it ever claimed that the Jedi must exist for the light to exist? They were a force for balance and for the light side, not the light itself. And Jake Skywalker of all people should know that. Despite the countless Jedi who apparently survived the Purge, the movies tell us that the moment Yoda died in Return of the Jedi, the Order was effectively dead. Jake chose to revive it. Kenobi and Yoda taught Luke to beware his emotions and to strengthen his faith, reach his understanding far beyond the crude matter of the body, while Luke followed the Jedi teachings. And the reason why finding Jedi Master Jake was so important in The Force Awakens is because the Jedi were heroes, a force for good in the galaxy. Rey knew it, Finn knew it, even Mark Hamill knew it. And this is why Luke felt so out of character, and why Mark Hamill felt so betrayed by his characterization in the film. This Jake Skywalker learned a truth to a lie that never existed. The Force never belonged to the Jedi. There was never for a moment when Kenobi or Yoda said that the Force was property of the Order. Lesson 1 feels more like a metacritique of what fans believe, but it isn't consistent with the story's canon. In fact, what Kenobi said was, the Force is what gives a Jedi his power. It's an energy field created by all living things. It surrounds us and penetrates us. It binds the galaxy together. A Jedi is empowered by the Force. They dedicate itself to learning its secrets, but they believe the Force to be universal. It belongs to no one. For Luke Skywalker of all people to cry otherwise tells us this isn't Luke Skywalker at all. The words behind this first lesson can only be said by someone who never lived through Luke Skywalker's experiences. Yet, as nonsensical as lesson 1 might be, his second lesson is far more insulting, because it's the second lesson when Jake Skywalker lays his cards on the table. With Finn and Poe, the film chastised male heroism in general, but here The Last Jedi tears down the very heart of the franchise and everything so many loved about Star Wars. To quote, "Now that they're extinct, The Last Jedi are romanticized, deified, but if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris. At the height of their power, they allowed Darth Sidious to rise, create the Empire, and wipe them out. It was a Jedi Master who was responsible for the training and creation of Darth Vader." Rey responds, and this is important, by saying, "And a Jedi who saved him. Yes, the most hated man in the galaxy, but you saw there was conflict inside him. You believed that he wasn't gone, that he could be turned." And then we have Jake Skywalker not only lamenting his past actions of heroism, but the hubris it supposedly gave him. And the Last Jedi Defender's favorite talking point, his almighty bloodline. "And I became a legend. For many years there was balance, and then I saw Ben, my nephew, with that mighty Skywalker blood. In my hubris, I thought I could train him. I could pass on my strengths. Han was Han about it. But Leia trusted me with her son. I took him and a dozen students and began a training temple. By the time I realized I was no match for the darkness rising inside him, it was too late. I went to confront him and he turned on me. He must have thought I was dead. When I came to, the temple was burning. He had vanished with a handful of my students and slaughtered the rest. Leia blamed Snoke, but it was me. I failed because I was Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master, a legend." First of all, the Jedi Master who taught Darth Vader was Obi-Wan Kenobi, Luke's former mentor. Luke not only blind items Kenobi in a severe display of disrespect, but outright throws him under the bus. Jake places a great deal of the Order's failure on Obi-Wan's shoulders because he allowed the training of Darth Vader. Not only is blaming Kenobi unreasonable, I would venture to argue that the Luke Skywalker we know would have done the same had he been in Kenobi's position, because the Luke we know, even at his most cynical, believed in giving people a second chance. Unlike Disney's childish view of the light and the dark, evil isn't predestined or a switch in someone's brain. Everyone deserves a chance, which is the exact reason Luke put everything on the line to save his father, and that's after he'd been evil for a few decades. There were many factors that led to Anakin's fall, but Anakin Skywalker's downfall was ultimately his fault. He was the one who chose to let pride warp his mind. He was the one to allow the dark to seduce him to its side. This current year thinking likes to place full blame on the parent or mentor for the evil deeds of the student, so the student remains sympathetic and washed clean of their sins. But evil is a choice, even in Star Wars. This is how it was characterized when Anakin Skywalker chose to follow the Emperor, and also when Luke defeated Darth Vader and chose not to kill his father. Second of all, if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure. Jake Skywalker claims that the Jedi's legacy is failure because Palpatine rose up and killed them all, that they're simply puffed up by romanticism and not by achievement. And maybe if someone had only considered the events of the Clone Wars, they might have had a case. But remember what Obi-Wan said. For over 1,000 generations, the Jedi Knights were the guardians of peace and justice in the Old Republic. The Clone Wars were the final saga in the Jedi Order. By that time, they'd reached a state of decadence. They were in no state to handle the revenge of the Sith. The Order here was in its twilight era. So Jake is trying to convince us that stripping away the myth and looking at the Jedi's deeds would only reveal failure. But the rise of Palpatine and Darth Vader, Jake's entire evidence of failure, only occurred after 1,000 generations of peace and justice guarded by the Jedi. Note, this isn't merely 1,000 years, but tens of thousands. And after 10,000 years of success, I think the Jedi have more than earned the romanticism and deification. Even if you strip away the myth, the legacy of the Jedi is nobility. Yet the film, Rian Johnson and his mouthpiece Jake Skywalker are more than ready to condemn a legacy of nobility for a few mistakes. Once again, there's no way a Luke Skywalker, who experienced the original trilogy like we watched him do, could ever come to these conclusions. This and his sudden unexplored fall to disillusionment are why so many fans demanded more of the story that connected the hero we followed to the mind mind-melted loon were subjected to in The Last Jedi. But none of that compares to the most brutal moment in Luke Skywalker's character assassination. And that is when Yoda returns as a Force ghost, burns the Jedi texts, and confronts Luke/Jake once again. To quote,
Skywalker, still looking to the horizon. Never here now, The need in front of your nose, Lost Ben Solo you did. Lose Rey you must not. Heeded my words not, did you? Pass on what you have learned. Strength, mastery, but weakness, folly, failure also. Yes, failure most of all. The greatest teacher failure is.
Once you get past the hilarity of Yoda coming back from the dead to spill out the movie's supposed message, we have to witness the most iconic figure of the Jedi Order literally burn away the old Jedi traditions. A literal destruction of traditional heroism. And then the old master's words set the stage for the fetishization of failure held dear by the film's defenders. Remember when I said The Last Jedi characterizes male heroism as egotistical, and that the movie only ever acknowledges half the truth about male heroes? It embraces the hero at the start of his journey, but ignores any growth or maturity a man might endure. Yoda saying, Skywalker, still looking to the horizon, never here now, the need in front of your nose, conveys that exact sentiment. This is Luke from a dark timeline, one who blames others for his own failures. A Luke who'd rather hide like a child and slink off to die than face the consequences of his own actions, who never learned true failure. A Luke who never grew up. A Luke who perfectly symbolizes the views of The Last Jedi. And this is the central reason why Jake Skywalker feels so different from the Luke Skywalker he was meant to be. Remember, Luke defied Yoda to save his friends in The Empire Strikes Back, yet failed to save anyone. Cloud City was lost. Luke had learned his father had become an ultimate evil and took a humiliating loss, where he was forced to confront his own mortality. And to make things worse, Han was sent off to certain death at the hands of Jabba the Hutt. The Luke Skywalker we saw grow and mature had already experienced failure and conquered his temptations. This is why Mark Hamill could confidently say that Master Luke Skywalker wouldn't give up, that he'd never reject the Jedi and he'd work to correct his mistakes, because the character had matured. So why now did he try to kill Ben Solo? Why did he crumble from a single failure? Why did he choose to hide and impotently blame the Jedi rather than face his family? Because The Last Jedi wanted yet another forced example of men are egotistical babies who never grew up and that women kindly tolerate. Which is why Yoda belittles Luke/Jake just as Holdo and Leia belittled Poe. And pass on what you have learned? This is only natural. The original Star Wars trilogy only followed half of the hero's journey. The first half watches the rise of the hero. The final stage is the return, where the hero returns to society and passes on his wisdom to the next generation, which is kind of why the Jedi Academy game exists. The expanded universe had Luke establish a training temple on Yavin 4 and continue the Jedi Order. In other words, it was well understood that Luke would begin training a new generation of heroes. It was, after all, a major part of the traditional hero's journey, to pass on what you have learned. And this is something taken away by Disney and The Last Jedi most of all. So this moment between Yoda and Jake is undeniably the result of The Last Jedi's hostility towards male heroism. After all, the sequel trilogy is supposed to be Rey's journey. She's the one who's supposed to be learning and growing. Rey is the one who needed to fail and learn from that failure, but she's already perfect. No need to grow. So if this movie isn't anti-male and male heroism, why else do we need Jake to remember lessons he'd already learned, while Yoda praises Rey?
The library contains nothing that the girl Rey does not already possess. Luke, we are what they grow beyond. This is the true burden of all masters.
Noting that Rey not only knew the truth that Luke had to lose a hand to learn and then just forgot, but that she already surpassed Luke somehow. Never underestimate the power of waving things around, I guess. Now, outside the movie, this makes sense. Rey is a Mary Sue, and therefore is the bestest ever. But within the logic of the movie, this makes no sense at all. Rey never failed up to that point. Specifically, she never failed and then worked to right that wrong. Luke lost Han to Jabba, returned to Yoda to complete his training, and then journeyed off to correct his mistake with newfound power. Rey waves around her lightsaber on an island and Force Skype Ben Solo. That's it. So again, why force Luke to forget the entire original trilogy? Why turn him into Jake and have Yoda gush about how awesome Rey is if the point wasn't to finger wag at men and male heroism? So what might this story look like if we remove the hostility from the narrative? Well, if The Last Jedi's ultimate lesson is the greatest teacher failure is, then why not have Luke Skywalker actually train Rey? Have Rey fail every challenge Luke offers until she's on on the verge of giving up. Maybe she has a crisis of conscience, feeling the full guilt of her own failure because her failure means her own newfound family will die. And then this is when Yoda pops up and says, "The greatest teacher failure is." Remember, Rey grew up on the legends of victorious heroes. Tales of their embarrassing failures aren't often known, let alone told. And this is why Rey puts so much pressure on herself and why it seems so hopeless. Yoda tells her about Luke's duel with Vader in Cloud City. He tells of Luke's failure then, but also what he learned. This is when Rey thinks over the challenges she's faced and why she failed each one. Then, after some self-reflection and a few more attempts, she succeeds. And that victory begins a cascade of more victories. Maybe Luke even volunteers the moment he doubted Yoda and was humiliated by the old master for that defiance. If you want to keep Luke as the old disillusioned mentor, maybe we have him grow too, but not by relearning lessons he's already learned, but by learning new ways to teach. Luke remembers how Obi-Wan and Yoda taught him, how not every student is the same. Luke might have mastered the Force, but he hadn't mastered the art of teaching, and he can learn this mastery with Rey. In summary, Rey learns that a hero can fail, but that a hero should learn from those failures, while Luke learns how to be a proper teacher, something he also had failed at. Everything a story like The Last Jedi was traditionally meant to convey, but with proper character growth for Rey and deference to Luke Skywalker. But again, TLJ isn't a traditional story about hopeful heroes failing and learning from their mistakes. No, TLJ's failure story is different. It's not about the failure of heroes who must eventually be enlightened by their wizened mentors. It's about the failure of men who must eventually be enlightened by women. And the emphasis on Jake's supposed failures, the Jedi's supposed failures, and the loss of Jake's entire character arc, while Rey is praised by Yoda for being so great, is a testament to this viewpoint. Now we return to the original question. The Last Jedi tells us Poe was wrong for taking action. The correct answer was to trust Leia and Holdo. Finn was wrong for taking action. The correct answer was to trust Leia and Holdo. Rey, however, was wrong for trusting Luke Skywalker, and the correct answer was to take action. So then, what do I mean when I say Rey was wrong to trust Luke? Rey and Jake have a final confrontation on the island, and after Rey beats up Jake, because of course she does, we get this exchange. Rey, there's still conflict in him. If he were to turn from the dark side, that could shift the tide. This could be how we win. Jake, this is not going to go the way you think. Rey, it is. Just now when we touched hands, I saw his future, as solid as I'm seeing you. If I go to him, Ben Solo will turn. Luke, Rey, don't do this. Rey is taking her lead from the Luke Skywalker of legend, the one we know from the original trilogy. The final confrontation Rey has with the old master has Jake Skywalker pleading for her not to rush off to save Kylo Ren. He requests inaction, that it's not going to go the way she thinks. However, Rey senses conflict in Kylo Ren, just as Luke Skywalker had sensed in Darth Vader. And this is why I noted how different Luke Skywalker is compared to his portrayal in The Last Jedi. Here's Rian Johnson's big trick, how he bashes heroism and Luke Skywalker, while allowing The Last Jedi's hostile view on masculine heroism to prevail, and also allowing Rey to be correct in the end. Luke had defied his masters for the chance to save his father, and so Rey chose to follow suit. In the end, however, Kylo Ren doesn't turn as Rey had foreseen. Rey's decision to play at Kylo Ren's redemption had ultimately resulted in Kylo elevated to the highest power in the First Order, something that really couldn't have happened without Rey's assistance. In short, Kylo Ren was set up for redemption, but became irredeemable, at once proving Jake Skywalker's, The Last Jedi's, and Rian Johnson's cynical views correct, and Luke Skywalker's optimistic views and the traditional heroism he represents once again as romantic fantasy. A fantasy Jake Skywalker explained is pushed by hubris, the same hubris the movie demonizes in Poe earlier on. However, as correct as Jake was about Kylo Ren, he still has to be wrong. He is a man after all. And there's the big trick. Rey was wrong when it concerned saving Kylo Ren. In other words, she was wrong when she took her lead from Luke Skywalker. His brand of heroism isn't allowed to prevail here. However, while Jake's choice was to hide away, choosing inaction, Rey chose to heroically take action just as Finn and Poe had done. While Poe's actions only hurt the Resistance and tarnished his reputation, and Finn's actions nearly caused the annihilation of the entire Resistance, Rey's actions resulted in the death of Supreme Commander Snoke, inspired Jake Skywalker back into action, and saved the Resistance. Skywalker's actions that day would inspire hope throughout the galaxy, and we have Rey's infinite wisdom to thank for it. Under what big brain metric would this be considered a failure? Poe's actions hurt his allies. Finn's actions hurt his allies, while Rey's actions toppled the First Order leader and saved her allies. So failure is the best teacher, but only men need need to learn that lesson? Doesn't seem fair to me. The film directly tells us that the Jedi were failures, that these paragons of traditional heroism were never worth romanticizing, and that traditional heroism, the kind that Luke exemplified and Poe became the face of, isn't worth pursuing. Instead, The Last Jedi insists it highlights a different kind of hero, one which is exemplified most by Holdo, someone supposedly driven by empathy over ego. Remember, The Last Jedi hammers home the message that male heroism is childish and is ultimately self-serving. To recall the words of Leia, Poe, get your head out of your cockpit. There are things that you cannot solve by jumping in an X-Wing and blowing something up. I need you to learn that. Childish egotism. The Jedi have been the personification of heroism in the Star Wars universe ever since the beginning, yet this is how Luke Skywalker, one of their greatest heroes, describes them. Now that they're extinct, the Jedi are romanticized, deified, but if you strip away the myth and look at their deeds, the legacy of the Jedi is failure, hypocrisy, hubris. Hubris. Ego once again. And how does Skywalker, the icon of heroism in the Star Wars universe, talk about himself in The Last Jedi? And I became a legend. For many years there was balance, and then I saw Ben, my nephew, with that mighty Skywalker blood. In my hubris, I thought I could train him. I could pass on my strengths. Leia blamed Snoke, but it was me. I failed. Because I was Luke Skywalker, Jedi Master, a legend. Hubris and ego once again. So what made Holdo any different? She too wanted to save people, and even sacrifice herself to keep the First Order from destroying the Resistance with the Holdo maneuver. To once again quote Leia, she was more interested in protecting the light than she was seeming like a hero. And there's our answer. Empathy. According to the film, what makes Holdo so much better than Poe is her lack of ego, not caring about seeming like a hero, that she placed her love for the Resistance over personal glory, protecting the light. And this is likely the mentality behind glorifying Holdo for her sacrifice, while Finn's own attempted sacrifice towards the end is interrupted by Rose Tico and considered wrong. When the Resistance is making their desperate assault on the First Order battering ram, the situation becomes too dangerous. Poe calls off the attack. The cannon is charged. It's a suicide run. However, Finn decides to continue his run, and then he says this line, "No, I won't let them win." To the audience, Finn wants to sacrifice himself for his friends, but in the view of The Last Jedi, this is Finn wanting to be a hero, wanting to appease his ego and glorify himself more than he wants to protect the light or something. And if you're still not convinced, Rose Tico chimes in to directly define what the difference is between Holdo's sacrifice and Finn's sacrifice. To quote, "I saved you, dummy. That's how we're going to win. Not fighting what we hate, saving what we love." Holdo sacrificed herself to stop the First Order from destroying the Resistance escape ships. In other words, according to the movie, she wasn't fighting what she hated. Holdo was saving what she loved. Again, protecting the light. When Finn decided to defy Poe's orders and chose to sacrifice himself, according to the movie, he wasn't doing so to save what he loved. He was doing so for the same reason Leia yelled at Poe, because Finn wanted to be a hero. I won't let them win. Holdo apparently acted out of empathy, while Finn acted from ego. Hubris. And that's why Finn, Poe, Luke, Jake, and even the Jedi are all wrong. And the movie assumes that male heroes only ever act selfishly. And why Leia tells Poe he was wrong because he was too concerned with seeming like a hero, while Holdo wasn't concerned at all. And then Poe acts as if he was hit with some kind of grand realization. It would have been easy to write a young male hero obsessed with accolades. Maybe Poe's mission could have been completely unsanctioned by Leia instead of called off halfway. Maybe he could have convinced the bombers to follow him for the sake of glory and legend. And so those bombers died and were unavailable for a future critical Resistance plan. But that's not what happened. To quote Poe, "No, General, we can do this. We have a chance to take out the Dreadnought. These things are fleet killers. We can't let it get away." These are the words of a man who wants to strike the enemy to save his allies. Finn's self-sacrifice was to strike the enemy to save his allies. These are both examples of masculine heroism, and this is the attitude constantly demonized by the film. And this is probably why so many fans felt so personally attacked, why they felt the movie itself hated Star Wars. The movie declares Holdo right because she acted out of empathy, fighting only when it protected the Resistance. Rey, too, was considered right, not because she fought Snoke and Kylo, but because she walked away from Kylo, walked away from the fighting, and saved the Resistance in their darkest hour. Jake Skywalker was right in the very end, because he chose not to fight the First Order, merely slowed them down and gave his life to buy time for their escape. And so the movie asserts that men must learn to emulate women, develop empathy, and value that empathy over their own pride. And this is why traditional traditional heroes, and the heart of Star Wars had to be broken for the sake of The Last Jedi. Rey had hoped following the steps of Luke Skywalker would win the day. She could turn Kylo Ren to the light and spark the First Order's downfall. But Jake Skywalker, and effectively Rian Johnson, told Rey not to even try. And in the end, Rey was wrong to trust Luke Skywalker, because his way, the traditional heroic way, only resulted in Kylo Ren rising in power and solidifying his journey to the dark side. While Jake Skywalker had supposedly been crushed by his own hubris and chose to retreat away from life, preaching complete inaction. In short, Rey tries to follow the path of Luke Skywalker and his method fails. Rey instead defies Jake Skywalker, saves the Resistance, and inspires the old master back into action, proving that his method fails, ultimately allowing Rey to prove both Luke and Jake wrong. To reiterate, a young hero might throw himself into battle for pure glory. This is a notion the leaders of Europe used to convince their young men to happily fight World War I. It's the flurry of patriotic speeches that pushed Paul Baumer and his entire class to volunteer to fight in all quiet on the Western Front. A matured male hero, on the other hand, will throw himself into battle to protect his friends and family, to take pain so others won't have to. As mentioned, this is exactly the journey Luke Skywalker took. Young Luke ran headfirst into the Death Star for the glory of winning the princess, while older Luke entered the Death Star to save his father's soul. The battles matured heroes choose to fight are driven by empathy. Remember, Finn wanted to leave in order to warn Rey, and Poe's every action, from heroics to mutiny, were to save his friends in the Resistance. They were not trying to be heroes, they were trying to save lives. But The Last Jedi doesn't acknowledge maturity in men. It's not here to explore the truth, but to break the heart of Star Wars. And if you're still skeptical after all this, Rian Johnson all but details this mentality in a speech delivered by Miles Braun, the villain of Knives Out, Glass Onion. To quote, "If you want to shake things up, you start with something small. You break a norm, or an idea, or a convention, some little business model, but you go with things that people are kind of tired of anyway. Everybody gets excited because you're busting up something that everyone wanted broken in the first place. That's the infraction point. That's the place where you have to look within yourself and ask, am I the kind of person who will keep going? Will you break more things? Will you break bigger things? Are you willing to break the thing that nobody wants you to break? Kind of like a PBS Kids rendition of Genius. If you just make a mess, you could be a genius too." Much like the trajectory of modern art, the philosophy of The Last Jedi has all the maturity of a child throwing a tantrum, and all the honesty of a child trying to explain the resulting mess to his mother. And that's just it. The mentality is merely breaking things just because they're old or valuable. Miles Braun is essentially the purest form of a cultural vandal, but his mentality made him one of the richest, most powerful men on Earth. Once upon a time, traditions were respected, but this modern audience era has reduced the great pursuit of storycraft to mere content, disposable. Or, as Bret Easton Ellis, author of Imperial Bedrooms and American Psycho, mentions in his book White, the absence of an analog, tactile truth of a world where everything is actually real. Certainly for artists, it's a big question mark. A lot of the performance of connoisseurship is being lost in a tidal wave of disposability. Culture has become so democratized that the notion of craft is gone. Under the Last Jedi's school of thought, dedication to craft and tradition are resented. Substance is meaningless, and building blocks of story are dismissed. Things like plot and character development are seen as unimportant in the face of the almighty theme, but again, only surface level. The wordcraft of a great orator can likely convey a message far better than someone simply shouting a theme on stage. In a story, a theme is only as strong as the narrative structure that supports it, and the author's skill that crafts it. The only value with the Rian Johnson school of thought is to monopolize attention through disruption, as Miles Braun put it. Or as Kylo Ren put it, let the past die. Kill it if you have to. The Last Jedi itself is so romanticized, deified, for merely subverting the audience's expectations. Any reason or meaning is immaterial. The celebration is over the mere existence of a subversion. With Miles, as long as something is disrupted, the disruptor has value. With The Last Jedi, as long as expectations were subverted, the movie apparently has value. But really, the disruptive exhibitions are shallow, a novelty for the moment. The entire school of thought is as philosophically significant as a jump scare. Or, as Bret Easton Ellis puts it, the culture seemed like it would no longer belong to the Titans, but instead to whoever could seize its attention with whatever immediacy and force. If Empire was about the heroic American figure, solid, rooted in tradition, tactile and analog, then post-Empire was about people who were understood to be ephemeral right away. Digital disposability doesn't concern them. They're rooted in traditions created by social media, which is solely about exhibition and surface, and they don't follow a now dated path of artistic and cultural development. This is probably why the Mary Sue has become the modern goddess of the modern audience. A Mary Sue is perfect. She's effortlessly beautiful, powerful, competent, humbles these egotistical men who dare see themselves as anything but tantrum-throwing children, and most importantly, she's you. Just as The Last Jedi and its defenders fetishize failure, I don't think it's a coincidence that Rey Nobody's lowly and ambiguous background is likewise fetishized. To quote a 2024 screenwriter article titled "Rey Nobody is Rey Anybody," Rey being a nobody was brilliant, and it continues to be important to the franchise. Rey was designed as the ultimate self-insert for a new generation of fans. The modern movie, made for a modern audience, isn't made for the old traditions of personal growth and aspirational heroes. They're forged from tradition born out of social media. No longer aspirational, but egotistical. The Last Jedi is a girl boss power fantasy and a chastisement of masculinity. Men are tantrum-throwing children and failures. Male heroism is foolish. Girls are enlightened, and girl power wins the day. You're already better than the icky boys. No work required. The Force is female after all. Social media is about the dream of cheap celebrity. You don't need to spend years learning to act, perfecting skills, suffering humiliation, and enduring years of rejection to become a star. You just need one viral video and suddenly you're worth millions. And so we arrive at the core theme of every modern audience movie. You're already awesome, the world just needs to learn about it. But only if you're a girl. Boys have work to do. Social media lets people see themselves as comedians, models, gamers, and cooks without the journey one traditionally took to earn those titles. This is likely how we get the notion that the audience needs to see themselves as heroes in television and film. The Last Jedi's hostile attitude towards traditional and masculine heroism is no surprise. By tearing down the traditional hero who worked, suffered, and bled to achieve his strength, they can better dismiss the value of craft, personal growth, those pesky indignities that come with true failure, the very idea that you're flawed or seriously imperfect, and better validate the Mary Sue, who's already perfect, without risk of harming your pride or suffering indignity, your ultimate self-insert. But in smashing tradition, leaving behind craft, growth, and aspirational figures, we lose our humanity, humility, and respect. Because spending your life simply looking into the mirror doesn't help you grow, or show the value of things beyond the surface. This is why Miles Braun celebrates disruption, but scoffs at the hostile attitude people have when he tries to break the system, the old traditions. But that's also why perfecting one's craft is so important, and enduring the pain is worth it. Because that pain is what failure stories used to be about, what The Empire Strikes Back was about. Because failure, oddly enough, teaches you something. And this is why, time and time again, I attempted to give you counterexamples to scenes in The Last Jedi. What if Poe was respected? What if Finn was allowed to grow? What if Rey was the one who failed and forced to learn from her mistakes? And this is why the degradation of the Jedi was so important. Personal growth isn't the point of modern audience movies. It's an affront to their worldview. It's about feeding the audience's ever-growing narcissism, because that's what the modern audience is. That's what the post-Empire audience is. Selfish, emotional, immature children who never grew up and who hungers for constant validation. The exact same accusation Rian Johnson's film tosses at masculine heroes. Rey is the audience's stand-in, perfect and powerful. She knows everything so well, Yoda praises her, while Luke Skywalker, the face of the old traditions, the face of the Jedi, the face of the past, is the one who must learn. He, unlike Rey and the modern audience, is old and imperfect, and needs to step out of the way. Or to once again quote Rian Johnson's Yoda,
"We are what they grow beyond. This is the true burden of all masters."
telling the audience that he, Luke Skywalker, and the Jedi are now things of the past we must leave behind. Kill them off if we have to. And telling the old Star Wars fans who dare throw negativity at Disney Star Wars that this is no longer their story. The Disney era isn't for them. It's grown beyond them and towards a new generation of Star Wars. A new generation. A timeless cope for failure meant to take focus off Lucas-era Star Wars and place the full attention on Disney's precious saga. In truth, the original trilogy was built on the traditional hero and the hero's journey. The original story was already timeless. If you truly wanted to introduce a new generation addition to Star Wars, one should always start with A New Hope. But what exactly are we leaving behind by moving past these time-tested universal traditions? I think, once again, Bret Easton Ellis puts it fairly well. Not winning, but disappointment, disillusionment, and pain made joy, happiness, awareness, and success both tangible and noticeably more intense. I realized at an early age, we didn't get ribbons for doing a good job, and we weren't awarded for just showing up. There were actual winners and losers. School shootings didn't yet exist, at least they weren't epidemic, but we were bullied by older kids, and usually without parental commiseration, or even comment, and we definitely weren't told how special we were at every opportunity. Yet I can't remember hearing about a single peer's suicide during my childhood and adolescence. It was the out-of-control defiance of horror movies that made this seem how the world actually works. You win some, you lose some. This is life. This is all preparing me for something. The obsession with theme above all else, with empty, meaningless art, with destruction for destruction's sake. These modern audience sensibilities, beloved by modern art bros, don't elevate art at all. They destroy it. To once again quote Bret Easton Ellis, pop culture now would be hesitant to invite anyone like Sinatra or Miles Davis or James Brown back in. It chilled me to realize that maybe this democratization hadn't been all great for pop culture itself. How would any of those artists have fared in a self-censorious society, in which everyone tiptoes around, trying to appease every group that might take offense at any opposing view? In essence, shutting down creative excellence, thanks to the fears and insecurities and ignorance of others. Could Sinatra have been forced into singing songs that exclusively made us feel dreamily better about our own identities, while ignoring the painful realities of life and human existence? The internet over tried to convince us that The Last Jedi was a masterpiece ahead of its time, that our hatred was foolish and short-sighted, that we were letting what we wanted cloud the supposed genius it gave us, that years down the line, The Last Jedi would be granted its due accolades and celebrated in the same breath as The Empire Strikes Back, because it dared to break the mold, subvert our expectations, and disrupt the very foundations of Star Wars. To once again recall the words of Pablo Picasso, learn the rules like a pro so you can break them like an artist. The modern art bro loves this quote, and defenders of The Last Jedi love it all the more. It sounds so similar to Rian Johnson's philosophy and Miles Braun's disruption speech. At first glance, it seems to imply a mentality of destruction. Tear down the system and rewrite the rules because that's what an artist does. However, the key words here are like a pro. Like Bret Easton Ellis noted, it was always assumed an artist pursued his artistic craft, that he worked for something better, endured pain, and risked ridicule and poverty to reach new heights. As Alan Moore said, "A decision I made earlier on was that I refused to be working upon something that I was not interested in. I didn't want writing to become a drudge, like the job I was leaving to become a writer. There would be no point at all. So what I thought was that I should adopt the policy of only working upon things that I was enjoying and was interested in, which initially raises a problem because I was also desperate for work and trying to feed a family. I was deciding to take any work offered to me, and even if it was from a field completely outside my interest, say something like football, I could find a way in which I could make it interesting to myself." Any child can throw a tantrum and give us Luke as a totally different character because it's unexpected. It takes an artist to give us Master Yoda as an unexpectedly tiny creature because his mastery, despite his small stature, highlights the mystical nature of the Force. There's a common accusation that holding art to an objective standard ruins art, but the truth is the opposite. Celebrating creators and their work, not for an ability to bend the rules, but for simply breaking the rules, represents the destruction of the craft. It's far more impressive to see an artist bend the rules of storycraft and cleverly breathe new life into old tropes than it is to witness someone who fancies themselves an artist take a baseball bat to the most sacred elements of storytelling. To quote the host of this particular feast, Mahler, people seem to think that fantasy as a genre and subsequently science fiction or space operas do not adhere to rules. This is a myth and a poorly propagated one. Good writing adheres to rules. Bad writing forgets them. The Last Jedi not only forgets the rules, it finds them undeniably offensive. And by the time Rian Johnson was finished, the Star Wars franchise looked like it just went 15 rounds with Apollo Creed. To once again quote Alan Moore, "All my commercial successes were never planned as such. They were all remote outsiders that people liked. They liked them because they were well written, not because they were watching some current trend." Never underestimate the value of a traditionally well-written story. Evil Dead, for example, had a shoestring budget of $375,000, yet it started a franchise. The Last Jedi wielded all the power of Disney and still became the catalyst that ended one. one. There's a reason why heroes like Harry Potter, Spider-Man, and Luke Skywalker remain icons of pop culture, while Rey is iconically despised. The traditional hero inspires us into action. We watch them grow and struggle and persevere. The traditional hero shows us that dragons can be defeated, while Rey is a Mary Sue, a cheap thrill, a disposable bland fantasy who exists to be the ideal version of you, and therefore is ultimately an empty vessel with no value beyond the novelty of the moment. But let's be fair and look into the perception of The Last Jedi. Did its hostile attitude towards tradition cause it to burn, or were the art bros right? Was the film a masterpiece in defiance of craft, artistry, and tradition? Well, not according to an article titled, "I Changed My Mind: Why This Passionate Last Jedi Defender Has Become One of Its Biggest Critics." To quote, "I loved how The Last Jedi subverted many tropes we'd come to expect in Star Wars. All the scenes with Luke and Rey, and how it seemingly gave the third film the freedom to do anything. I think the overwhelmingly negative reaction from some online fans pushed me further away, as many of their criticisms seemed unfair or greatly exaggerated. I'm embarrassed to admit I engage in more than one heated debate with The Last Jedi haters on Reddit. I don't hate The Last Jedi, but I am now at the point where I find it incredibly frustrating. But making Luke a grumpy hermit who has given up, it feels like the entire plot of The Force Awakens was a waste of time, because the First Order had no reason to fear Luke helping the Resistance. I've also come to appreciate Luke Skywalker's original characterization and hero's journey, so I hated him undergoing such a radical change off-screen. The movie makes similarly frustrating decisions with other characters, and almost every scene has plot holes and elements that don't make sense. Why does the Resistance have a fleet of slow, vulnerable bombers when Y-Wings have existed for several decades? Why does the First Order not use their massive fleet to simply surround the Resistance instead of slowly chasing them? It's okay for a space fantasy to have some silly ideas, but it becomes distracting when it's a pattern. Many character arcs also feel redundant or poorly executed, which is a shame since I was so invested with them in The Force Awakens. Nearly everything set up by the first movie feels like it was cancelled out, forcing the next film to develop a last-minute plot. I honestly have a hard time seeing The Last Jedi as more than a ripoff of The Empire Strikes Back's plot structure, but with familiar Star Wars moments subverted for shock value. Now doesn't all that sound familiar? 8 years down the line, and The Last Jedi isn't simply an objectively bad film, but the worst Star Wars movie, at least so far. The harsh reality is that pesky tradition prevailed once again, but perhaps the harsher reality is that the attitude towards The Last Jedi is less of an underrated masterpiece finally gaining its due praise and more of an illusion finally losing its strength. So why did we hate The Last Jedi? Why did we judge so harshly? Did we cast aside a bold installation into the Star Wars universe simply because it failed to give us what we wanted? Well, no, not even in the most generous sense. In fact, that was its core issue. A film can defy the typical story the audience expects, if that defiance is clever and breaks the rules like an artist. Just look at Star Trek: The Voyage Home. A story about the Earth needing whales before the Earth shatters to pieces isn't your typical Kirk versus alien menace storyline. The Last Jedi didn't simply refuse us what we wanted. It tore down what we loved. And I don't mean laser sword battles and explosions. While those are a draw, they're not what made Star Wars a cornerstone of American pop culture for generations. The Last Jedi belittled the male heroic fantasy that formed its moral and adventurous core. It shattered its optimism. It tore down the very idea of traditional heroism and destroyed Luke Skywalker to do so. Just like Holmes, Poirot, and Columbo aren't great detectives for simply knowing things or suddenly blinking answers into reality. They're clever because they take clues many people see and make intriguing connections that few others make. Likewise, a clever film isn't clever simply because it breaks tradition. A film is clever because it takes a story or trope millions have enjoyed and adds to them, or offers a new perspective few other people see. The Last Jedi, on the other hand, looked at what you loved, called it ugly, laughed at you for loving it in the first place, shattered it with a bat, and refused to pick up the pieces, let alone pay the bill. It effectively dragged out Luke Skywalker beaten and broken, forced this once great hero to demonize the universe's greatest heroes, and tell us that his own legacy is failure and not worthy of praise, right before the film executed him right in front of us. And people wonder why fans hated the film. And all of this destruction to appease an audience of narcissists and art bros who find aspirational heroism and the very idea of developing one's craft offensive, scary, or fascism somehow. Because how dare anyone say they're imperfect and need to grow? They find comfort in seeing great men fail. They don't want to be told to work hard. They want to gaze into a movie and see a Mary Sue, the perfect audience stand-in, their own perfected reflection staring back. To end, I'll say, I I disagree with Mueller when he said Star Wars cannot grow up, because I would say Star Wars had already grown up with Luke Skywalker, but just like so many other things in this modern era, it has regressed to something vain, selfish, and infantile, where once the old fandom applauded hard-won heroic triumph and heroes suffering through hardship, the Disney fandom gapes and giggles at the mere sound of a lightsaber. If all you want are movies to serve as mere idealized reflections, then do it the modern Disney way. But if you want a story that'll last generations, embrace the traditional hero, reject the modern audience, or waste your life looking into a mirror.